The rain had been falling on Portland for 3 days straight when Daniel Crawford walked through the door of Rosie's Diner at 6 minutes past 6 in the morning. The bell above the entrance chimed the same tired note it had chimed for the past 30 years, and the smell of coffee and bacon grease wrapped around him like an old blanket that had absorbed too many memories to ever be washed clean. He moved through the narrow aisle between the counter and the window booths with the automatic precision of a man whose body had memorized this journey so completely that his mind could wander elsewhere while his feet found their way. The booth in the corner by the window was empty as it always was at this hour on a Thursday. Daniel slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, feeling the familiar give of the cushion that had molded itself to his shape over 3 decades of early morning visits. Through the rain-streaked glass, the street lay dark and slick under the amber glow of streetlights that would soon surrender to a gray October dawn that promised nothing but more of the same weather. Betty appeared at his elbow before he had finished settling in a coffee cup already in her hand, steam rising from the dark liquid like a question mark dissolving into air. She set it down in front of him without asking, the same way she had done every Thursday for the past 15 years, ever since she had taken over the morning shift from old Marion, who had finally retired to Florida to live with her daughter. The usual, Danny. He nodded, and she was gone before he could have changed his mind, even if he had wanted to. The usual. 2 eggs over easy, 3 strips of bacon wheat toast with butter, and a refill on the coffee that would keep coming until he left. The Crawford Special, she had started calling it years ago, though the name always made him uncomfortable, as if he were someone worth naming a meal after. Daniel wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and let the heat seep into fingers that had grown stiff during the walk from his truck. 58 years old, and his hands still worked, still built, things still created and repaired and held together what the world tried to tear apart. But they ached in the morning now, especially in weather like this, and he had learned to be grateful for small warmths wherever he could find them. Through the window, he watched a delivery truck rumble past its headlights, cutting bright streaks through the rain. The driver was hunched forward over the wheel, probably cursing the weather, probably thinking about the warm bed he had left behind, probably counting the hours until his shift ended and he could go home to whatever home meant to him. Daniel understood that feeling. He had spent decades understanding it, learning to push through it, discovering that the work itself could become a kind of home if you let it. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. An old man sat at the counter nursing his own coffee and staring at nothing in particular, with the vacant expression of someone who had outlived most of the people who used to fill his days with meaning. A young couple occupied a booth near the door, leaning toward each other across the table, speaking in hushed voices that suggested either romance or conspiracy, or some complicated mixture of both. The cook worked in the back, the sound of sizzling grease and clanking pans providing a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet morning. Daniel let his gaze drift to the wall beside his booth, where a faded photograph hung in a simple wooden frame. It showed a younger version of this diner, probably from the 1970s, with a different sign out front and different faces behind the counter, but the same bones, the same essential character that had survived decades of change. He had been coming here since 1994, the year he moved to Portland, with Rachel and a head full of dreams about building a life in a city that felt like it might actually want them. Rachel, even now, 5 years after her death, the name moved through him like a tide, bringing with it a complex wash of love and grief, and something that had slowly begun to feel like gratitude. She had been the one who discovered this diner, wandering in one morning, while Daniel was at work, following the smell of coffee and the impulse that had always guided her toward places where real people gathered to share real moments. She had come home that night raving about the perfect eggs, and the waitress who actually listened when you talked, and the old man at the counter who had told her stories about the neighborhood back when it was still considered rough. They had made it their place after that. Saturday morning breakfast that stretched into afternoons, quick coffee stops between errands. The booth where he had proposed, fumbling the words so badly that Rachel had started laughing and then crying and then kissing him before he had even gotten the ring out of his pocket. The same booth where they had celebrated when they found out she was pregnant with Michael. The same booth where Daniel had sat alone on the night of her funeral, unable to face the emptiness of their house, nursing cold coffee until Betty had finally told him gently that it was past midnight and she needed to close up. The memories lived in this booth like ghosts that had made peace with their haunting. Daniel had learned to sit with them, to let them drift through without clutching at them or pushing them away. That was what 5 years of grief had taught him, if it had taught him anything. You did not get over loss. You got wider. You expanded to contain it, to make room for it alongside everything else, until the weight of what you had lost became part of what held you up. Betty returned with his plate, the eggs gleaming and perfect, the bacon crisp at the edges, the toast golden brown. She set it down in front of him with a small smile that acknowledged all the mornings they had shared this ritual without requiring either of them to comment on it. "How's Emma doing? Growing too fast. Started asking questions about boys last week." Betty's eyebrows rose. "She's 8. That's what I said. Apparently there's a kid named Tyler who sits next to her in class and she thinks his hair is stupid, but in an interesting way. Lord help us all. That's how it starts." She moved on to check on the old man at the counter, and Daniel turned his attention to his breakfast. He ate slowly, methodically, the way he did everything these days. There was no rush. The job site would wait. The foreman knew Daniel would show up when he showed up, and he knew Daniel would stay until the work was done, and that arrangement had worked for both of them for the better part of a decade. The eggs were perfect the way they always were. In a world that seemed determined to change everything, to tear down the familiar and replace it with something shinier and more complicated, the eggs at Rosie's Diner remained stubbornly, defiantly the same. Daniel found comfort in that. He had learned to find comfort wherever he could. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when the bell above the door chimed again, and something in the quality of the sound made him look up. Maybe it was the hesitation before the door fully opened, or the way the rain seemed to pour in more heavily than usual, or some instinct that 3 decades of life had honed into a kind of early warning system. Whatever it was, Daniel found himself watching as a woman stepped into the diner and stood just inside the entrance, dripping onto the worn linoleum floor. She was soaked. Not the kind of wet that came from running through rain between a car and a door, but the deep, saturated wet of someone who had been walking for a long time without shelter. Her hair hung in dark strings around a face that might have been beautiful if it had not been so pale, so drawn, so marked by exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than physical tiredness. Her clothes, Daniel noticed, were expensive, or had been before they had been worn for days, without washing before they had been slept in and walked in and rained on, until they hung on her body like flags of surrender. But it was her eyes that caught him and held him, dark brown, almost black in the diner's dim lighting, and filled with something that Daniel recognized from a time and place he had spent 30 years trying to forget. It was the look of someone who had been running so long they had forgotten what they were running from. The look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, not sure if they wanted to jump or be talked down, not sure if it even mattered anymore. He had seen that look in Kuwait, in the eyes of soldiers who had watched friends die and found themselves still alive, and could not understand why survival should feel like such a punishment. In his own reflection, once during the dark months after he came home, when the desert kept invading his dreams and the sound of distant thunder made him dive for cover on his own living room floor. The woman stood there for a long moment, rain dripping from her clothes and pooling at her feet, her eyes moving across the interior of the diner with the desperate calculation of a hunted animal seeking shelter. She took in the old man at the counter, young couple by the door, Daniel in his corner booth, Betty emerging from the back with a fresh pot of coffee. Then, as if making a decision that had cost her something, she moved toward a booth across the aisle from Daniel's and slid onto the seat. Her movements were careful, controlled, the movements of someone trying very hard not to attract attention, while knowing that she had already attracted far too much. Betty approached her with the same professional friendliness she offered to everyone, coffee pot in hand, smile in place. "Morning, hun. What can I get you?" The woman's voice was barely audible over the rain against the windows. "I'm sorry, I just need to sit for a moment. I won't stay long." Daniel watched Betty's expression shift, the professional smile softening into something more complicated. Concern, maybe, or recognition of a problem beyond her authority to solve. "You should eat something. Warm you up." "I can't. I don't have—" The woman trailed off her hands, moving in a helpless gesture that encompassed her soaked clothes, her empty pockets, her complete lack of anything that might constitute payment. Betty stood there for a moment, caught between diner policy and human decency, and Daniel found himself setting down his fork and reaching for his wallet. But before he could call out, before he could offer to cover whatever the woman wanted to order, Something shifted in the air, some subtle change in the quality of the silence, and he stopped. He looked at the woman again, really looked at her the way he had learned to look at structures before beginning work on them, searching for the hidden weaknesses that would determine how to proceed. She was not just hungry. She was not just tired or cold or wet. She was broken in some fundamental way, cracked along lines that went deeper than anything food or coffee could fix. Daniel pushed his plate across the table, the remaining eggs and bacon and toast sliding into the empty space on the opposite side of the booth. Then he stood up, crossed the narrow aisle, and stopped beside her table. "Mind if I sit?" The woman looked up at him with an expression that combined surprise and suspicion and something that might have been hope, though it was buried so deep beneath the exhaustion that Daniel could barely recognize it. He did not wait for an answer. He slid into the booth across from her and nodded toward the plate he had pushed to her side. "That's yours now. I already ate more than I should have anyway." "I can't." "Yes, you can. It's food. It's getting cold. And you look like you need it more than I ever did." She stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something, some sign of ulterior motive, some indication of what he expected in return. Daniel let her look. He had nothing to hide, and he had learned long ago that sometimes the most valuable thing you could offer another person was simply the patience to let them decide whether to trust you. Finally, something in her seemed to give way. She picked up the fork from the plate, her hand trembling slightly, and brought a bite of eggs to her mouth. Her eyes closed as she chewed, and Daniel saw a single tear slip down her cheek, cutting a track through the rainwater that still glistened on her skin. She ate in silence, quickly at first, then more slowly as her body began to register that it was finally being fed after what Daniel suspected was a long period of hunger. He watched her without speaking, sipping his coffee, giving her the space to do what she needed to do without the pressure of conversation. Betty appeared at his elbow with a fresh cup of coffee for the woman and a look for Daniel that communicated something between gratitude and curiosity. He gave a small shake of his head, a signal that he had this under control, that she should carry on with her morning without worrying about the drama unfolding in the corner booth. When the plate was empty and the woman was holding the coffee cup in both hands, drawing warmth from it, as if her life depended on that small heat, Daniel spoke again. "I'm Daniel. Most people around here call me Danny." She did not respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the surface of her coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate. "You don't have to tell me anything," he continued. "I don't need to know your name or your story or what brought you here looking like someone who's been through hell and hasn't found the exit yet. But I do need to tell you something, and I hope you'll listen." She looked up at that, her expression guarded but attentive. "I've been coming to this diner for 30 years. I've seen a lot of people come through that door. Happy people, sad people, people just looking for a cup of coffee and a place to sit. And every now and then, I've seen people come through looking the way you look right now, like they've reached the end of something and they're not sure what comes next." Daniel paused, turning his own coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I know that look. I've worn it myself. And what I've learned is this: whatever brought you to that edge, it's not the end. It feels like the end. It feels like there's nothing beyond this moment, nothing worth reaching for, nothing that could possibly make the fight worth continuing. But that's a lie. It's always a lie." The woman's eyes had begun to glisten, tears pooling but not yet falling. "I don't know you," Daniel said. "I don't know what you're running from or what you're afraid of or who put that look in your eyes. But I know that you walked through that door this morning instead of walking into traffic. I know you sat down instead of giving up. I know that somewhere in you there's still a part that believes things could get better or you wouldn't be here. And I want you to know that part is right." The tears fell then, silent and steady, tracking down her cheeks like rain on a window. "My name is Victoria." The words came out broken, barely more than a whisper. "Victoria, that's a beautiful name." She shook her head. "Nothing about me is beautiful anymore." "I don't believe that, but I understand why you might." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain continuing its steady assault on the windows, the diner continuing its morning routine around them, as if nothing unusual were happening in the corner booth. Betty refilled Daniel's coffee without being asked. The old man at the counter paid his bill and shuffled toward the door. The young couple by the entrance continued their whispered conversation. Victoria's voice, when it came again, was steadier, as if the act of speaking her name had released some of the pressure that had been building inside her. I've been walking since yesterday. I don't even know how I ended up here. I was just walking. Where did you start? A motel, about 12 miles north of the city. I couldn't stay there anymore. He knew where I was. He always knows where I am. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a cold understanding settling into place. Who always knows? Victoria's hands tightened around her coffee cup. A man. A man I used to love. A man I thought loved me. A man who... She trailed off, shaking her head. I can't. I can't talk about it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about. But if someone is looking for you, if someone has put you in danger, there are people who can help. Resources, shelters, police. The word seemed to strike her like a physical blow. No, no police. They can't help. They won't help. He has connections. He has money. He has everything and I have nothing, and every time I try to fight back, he finds a way to make it worse. Daniel nodded slowly. He had seen this before too, in different forms and different contexts, but always with the same essential shape. The predator and the prey. The powerful and the powerless. The person who had everything using it to destroy the person who had nothing. Okay, no police. Not yet anyway. But you need to eat something else. And you need to dry off before you catch pneumonia. And you need a place to stay that isn't a motel where someone can find you. Victoria looked at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and suspicion. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You have no reason to help me. Daniel thought about that question. He had been asking himself variations of it for most of his life, trying to understand why he felt compelled to reach out when others walked past, why the sight of someone in pain created an answering ache in his own chest that could only be relieved by action. I had a wife, he said finally. Rachel, she died 5 years ago, cancer. And before she died, she made me promise something. She made me promise that I would keep my eyes open, that I would see the people around me, really see them, and that when I saw someone who needed help, I would help them. Not because it would benefit me or because I expected anything in return, but because that's what humans are supposed to do for each other. He paused, looking out the window at the rain. I'm not a hero. I'm not even particularly brave. I'm just a guy who builds things for a living and goes home at night to a house that's too quiet and wakes up in the morning knowing that I've got one more day to try to keep that promise. And today that promise means sitting here with you and making sure you don't walk back out into that rain alone. Victoria was crying again, but differently now. The tears came with something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been carrying a weight for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to set it down even for a moment. I don't want to get you involved. He's dangerous. More dangerous than you can possibly understand. I've faced dangerous before. I spent 6 months in Kuwait during the Gulf War watching friends die and wondering every day if I would be next. I came home with nightmares that took years to fade and a limp that never went away. Whatever this man is, I've seen worse. You haven't. You can't have. Maybe. But that doesn't change the fact that right now in this moment, you need help and I'm here. So let me help. Let me buy you breakfast and find you somewhere dry to stay and see if we can figure out what comes next. No obligations, no expectations. Just one human being helping another. Victoria was silent for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup that had grown cold during their conversation. Daniel waited. He had learned the value of waiting, of giving people space to reach their own decisions instead of pushing them toward the answers he wanted to hear. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Okay, just okay. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not known he was carrying releasing its grip. Okay, first things first, Betty. Betty appeared at the booth, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes full of questions. Can we get another plate of the special and maybe some dry towels if you have them? I think I can manage that. She was back in minutes with a fresh plate of eggs and bacon, a stack of clean dish towels, and a look that promised a long conversation the next time Daniel came in alone. He handed the towels to Victoria, who began the slow process of drying her hair and face, her movements mechanical but growing steadier. She ate the second plate of food more slowly than the first, pausing between bites to breathe, to collect herself, to continue the process of becoming human again after whatever ordeal had driven her through 12 miles of rain-soaked streets. When she finished, Daniel pulled out his wallet and left enough cash on the table to cover both meals plus a generous tip. I have a truck outside. It's not fancy, but it's dry. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere he won't be able to find you. Victoria tensed. I don't know if anywhere is safe. Maybe not, but let's try anyway. The rain had not let up when they stepped outside, but Daniel had parked his truck close to the entrance, and Victoria was inside with the door closed before she had time to get much wetter than she already was. He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled out of the parking lot into the gray morning light. They drove in silence for several minutes, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the rain, the heater slowly filling the cab with warmth. Daniel navigated the familiar streets of Portland without conscious thought, his mind turning over the problem of where to take this woman who had appeared in his life like a storm-tossed ship seeking harbor. I have a house, he said finally, about 20 minutes from here in the Hawthorne district. It's not much, but it's mine. I built it myself 30 years ago when my wife and I first moved to Portland. I have a spare room. You can stay there until we figure out something more permanent. Victoria's head turned toward him sharply. I can't stay in your house. I don't even know you. And if he finds me there, if he traces me to you, then I'll deal with that if it happens. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you somewhere dry and safe. You have no idea what you're getting into. Probably not, but I've been getting into things I don't understand for 58 years now, and I'm still here. Let me worry about the risks. You just focus on catching your breath. The rest of the drive passed in silence. Daniel watched the streets scroll by outside the window, the familiar landmarks of the city he had called home for 3 decades emerging and receding through the rain. He thought about Rachel, about the promise he had made her, about the strange ways that life presented opportunities to keep or break the commitments we make to the people we love. He thought about Emma waiting for him at Mrs. Henderson's house, where she stayed on the mornings when Daniel had to be at work before she woke up. She would be wondering where he was, why he had not called yet, whether today would be a normal day or one of those days when something unexpected happened to disrupt their careful routine. And he thought about the woman sitting beside him, this stranger named Victoria, who had walked into Rosie's diner looking like death itself and who now sat wrapped in dish towels in the passenger seat of his truck, watching the city pass with eyes that seemed to be looking for threats in every shadow. The house on Maple Street looked the same as it always did when Daniel pulled into the driveway. A modest 2-story structure with white siding and green shutters set back from the road behind a yard that Rachel had spent years cultivating and that Daniel had kept alive in her memory. The porch needed painting, and one of the shutters was coming loose from its hinges, but overall the house stood solid and welcoming, a testament to the careful construction Daniel had put into building it. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment looking at the house. I built this place with my own hands. 30 years ago, when I was young and stupid and thought I knew everything about construction because I had been working on other people's buildings for a few years. It took me 18 months to finish working nights and weekends while I held down a full-time job. Rachel thought I was crazy. She was probably right. But I wanted to give her something that was ours, something that no one could take away, something that would last. Victoria followed his gaze to the house, her expression unreadable. It's beautiful. It's home. Come on, let's get you inside. The interior of the house was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and the wood polish Daniel used on the hardwood floors. He led Victoria through the entryway into the living room, where a worn couch and an old recliner faced a fireplace that he had not lit since last winter, but that still dominated the room with its brick facade and heavy wooden mantel. The spare room is upstairs, second door on the left. There's a bathroom attached, and there should be clean towels in the closet. You can take a shower, warm up. I'll find you some dry clothes. Victoria stood in the middle of the living room, looking around with an expression that combined wonder and wariness. I shouldn't be here. This is your home, your life. I don't have any right to. You have every right to be safe. That's all this is. A safe place to catch your breath. We can figure out the rest later. She stood there for another moment, her eyes moving across the family photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the accumulated evidence of a life lived fully in this space. Then something in her seemed to give way, the last reserves of resistance crumbling, and she nodded. Thank you. I don't have words for what this means. You don't need words. Just get yourself warm and dry. We'll talk when you're ready. Daniel watched her climb the stairs, her movements slow and careful like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain in the dark. When he heard the bathroom door close and the sound of water running, he let out a long breath and lowered himself onto the couch. What had he done? What was he doing? He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman fleeing from something that terrified her, something she believed was too dangerous for anyone to understand. He had no idea what he was getting into. No plan for what came next, no clear sense of whether his involvement would help or hurt. But he also knew that he could not have done anything else, that he would not have been able to live with himself if he had watched her walk back out into the rain and done nothing, that Rachel's face would have haunted him every time he closed his eyes if he had turned away from someone so obviously in need. The phone in his pocket buzzed, and he pulled it out to find a text from Emma. "Where are you? Mrs. Henderson says you're late." He typed back quickly. "Something came up. I'll explain later. Be there soon." Then he sat back on the couch and waited for the sound of the shower to stop for the next chapter of whatever story had just begun to start unfolding. The shower ran for a long time. Daniel did not begrudge her the luxury. He suspected it had been days since she had felt truly warm, truly clean, truly safe enough to stand under running water without fearing what might be waiting for her when she stepped out. He used the time to gather dry clothes from the closet in his bedroom. Rachel's things were long gone, donated to charity in those first raw months after her death, when he could not bear to look at them, but could not bring himself to throw them away either. But Emma had left some things in the guest room over the years, and one of Daniel's flannel shirts would be large enough to serve as a robe or a light jacket. He left the clothes in a neat pile outside the bathroom door, knocked once to let her know they were there, and retreated back downstairs. When Victoria finally came down nearly an hour after she had gone up, she looked like a different person. The haunted expression remained in her eyes, but her face had regained some color, and her hair now dry fell in dark waves around her shoulders. She wore Daniel's flannel shirt over one of Emma's old t-shirts and a pair of sweatpants that were slightly too long but clean and dry. "Better?" She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if still seeking warmth. "I should apologize for taking so long, for being here at all, for—" "Stop apologizing, you haven't done anything wrong." Daniel gestured toward the kitchen. "I made coffee, and I can make something more substantial if you're still hungry." "Coffee is fine." They sat at the kitchen table, mugs of coffee steaming between them, and Daniel gave her the space to speak when she was ready. The rain continued outside, drumming against the windows, creating a cocoon of gray around the small kitchen and the two people sitting in it. Victoria's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but steady. "His name is Richard Blackwell. I met him 2 years ago at a gallery opening in Seattle. I'm a photographer. Or I was. I had my own gallery, my own work, my own life. And then I met him, and everything changed." Daniel listened without interrupting as she told her story. The initial meeting, the charm, the attention, the way Richard had seemed to understand her in ways no one else ever had. The whirlwind romance, the engagement, the gradual isolation from friends and family that she had not recognized as isolation until it was too late. He was so subtle about it. He never forbade me from seeing anyone. He just always had something better planned. A trip somewhere beautiful. A dinner at a restaurant I had always wanted to try. And somehow, without my realizing it, my world shrank until he was the only thing in it. Daniel nodded. He had heard variations of this story before in different contexts and from different people, but always with the same essential pattern. The predator who started with seduction and ended with domination. The victim who did not understand what was happening until the trap had already closed. "When did you realize something was wrong?" "About 6 months in, I started noticing things. Money missing from my accounts, documents moved around in my files, small things at first, things I could explain away. But they kept adding up, and eventually I couldn't ignore them anymore." She paused, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. "I confronted him about it. I thought there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding. I thought he would explain it all away, and everything would go back to normal. But he didn't. No, he didn't explain anything. He didn't even deny it. He just changed, like a mask coming off. One minute he was the man I loved, charming and caring and attentive, and the next minute he was a stranger, cold, calculating. He told me that I belonged to him now, that everything I had was his. That if I tried to leave or tell anyone or do anything to undermine him, he would destroy me. And you believed him. I didn't want to, but he showed me things. Emails he had written from my accounts, making it look like I had authorized all the transfers. Documents with my forged signature. Evidence of affairs I had never had and business dealings I had never made. He had built an entire false version of my life, and he threatened to make it public if I didn't cooperate. Daniel felt a cold anger building in his chest, the kind of anger he had learned to control during his years in the military, but that never fully went away. So you cooperated. For a while, almost a year, I did everything he wanted. I signed over accounts. I sold my gallery. I cut off the few friends I had left. I became exactly what he wanted me to be because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. What changed? Victoria was silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. He got careless, or maybe he just got confident that I would never fight back. Either way, he left his laptop open one night while he was in the shower, and I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. What did you see? Emails, dozens of them, to other women, using the same playbook he had used on me, the same charm, the same promises, the same gradual tightening of the noose. I wasn't the only one. I wasn't even the first. I was just the current victim in a long line of victims. Daniel absorbed this information slowly, fitting it into the picture that was forming in his mind. Did you confront him again? No, I knew that would be a mistake. Instead, I started planning, gathering evidence, making copies of everything I could find. And 3 weeks ago, when he went on a business trip to New York, I ran. Where did you go? Portland. I had a friend here from college, or I thought I did. By the time I arrived, she had moved away, disconnected her phone, left no forwarding address. So I was alone in a city I barely knew with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few $100s I had managed to hide from him. And he followed you. Victoria nodded, her expression tightening with fear. He always follows. He always finds me. I don't know how. It's like he has eyes everywhere. I stayed in 3 different motels in 2 weeks paying cash using fake names, and every time within a day or two, he would show up. Not to confront me directly, just to let me know he was there. A car parked outside my window. A note slipped under my door. Once a bouquet of flowers with a card that just said, "You can't run forever." Daniel felt the anger in his chest grow hotter, more focused. He had dealt with bullies before in the schoolyard, in the battlefield, in the job site. Men who used their power to intimidate and control, who got pleasure from watching others cower before them. He had never had much tolerance for that kind of person. The last motel was yesterday morning, Victoria continued. I woke up and found a photograph on my pillow, a photograph of me sleeping. He had been in my room while I slept. He had stood over my bed and taken my picture, and I never even knew. Her voice broke on the last words, and Daniel watched her struggle to regain control. That's when I ran. I just started walking. I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. I just knew I couldn't stay in that room for another second. I walked all day and all night through the rain, and somehow I ended up at that diner this morning. And then you were there. Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, a gesture of comfort that he hoped would not be misinterpreted. You did the right thing. Running, fighting, refusing to give up. That took courage. More courage than most people have. It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing, and sometimes desperation is what gets you through when courage isn't enough. Victoria looked at him with eyes that seemed to be searching for something, some sign that she could trust this stranger who had appeared in her life at her lowest moment. Why are you helping me truly? What do you get out of this? Daniel thought about the question, about the many possible answers, about the complex mixture of motivations that drove human beings to do the things they did. I told you about my wife, about the promise I made her. But there's more to it than that. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I served in the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. I was a mechanic, not a combat soldier, but in that kind of conflict, everyone ends up in combat eventually. I saw things over there that I still dream about sometimes. Friends dying in explosions. Civilians caught in crossfire. The complete random cruelty of war where good people died and bad people lived, and none of it made any sense. Daniel looked out the window at the rain, seeing not the backyard, but the desert, the endless sand, the smoke rising from burning oil fields. When I came home, I was broken. Not on the outside, but inside where it doesn't show. I couldn't hold a job. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't be in crowded places without feeling like I was going to lose my mind. The only thing that kept me going was Rachel. She saw what I was going through, and instead of running away from it or trying to fix it, she just stayed. She stayed with me through the worst of it, through the nights when I woke up screaming and the days when I couldn't get out of bed. She stayed until I found my way back to something like normal. He turned back to Victoria. I made it through because someone was there for me. Someone who didn't ask what was in it for them. Someone who just saw a person in pain and decided to help. I'm not trying to repay that debt because I know it can never be repaid, but I am trying to pass it on, to be for someone else what Rachel was for me. Victoria's eyes were bright with tears again, but her expression had changed. The fear was still there, but alongside it was something that looked almost like hope. I don't know what to say. You don't have to buy anything, just rest, recover. We'll figure out the next steps when you're ready. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment, and Daniel looked toward the window with a mixture of relief and concern. That's probably my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She watches my granddaughter when I have to be somewhere early. Victoria's face registered surprise. Your granddaughter? Emma, she's 8. My son Michael and his wife Sarah were killed in a car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver. Emma was the only one who survived. So now she lives with me. He watched Victoria absorb this information, watched her understanding of who he was and what his life contained expand to include these new details. I'm so sorry. So am I, every day. But we're making it work, Emma and I. That's all anyone can do. The knock at the door came moments later, and Daniel went to answer it. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch holding Emma's hand, her weathered face creased with concern. Evelyn Henderson was 78 years old with steel gray hair that she kept in a practical bob and eyes that had seen more of life and death than most people could imagine. She had served as an Army nurse during Vietnam, spending 2 years at an evacuation hospital, where she had watched young men die by the dozens and had learned that the line between life and death was thinner than most people ever wanted to believe. She had retired from nursing 30 years ago, but had never retired from helping people. And she had been Daniel's closest neighbor and most trusted friend since the day he and Rachel had moved into the house on Maple Street. Danny, you want to tell me what's going on? Daniel stepped aside to let her in, and her sharp eyes immediately found Victoria standing in the kitchen doorway. Evelyn, this is Victoria. She's going to be staying here for a while. Mrs. Henderson looked at Victoria with the assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades reading people in moments of crisis. Then she looked at Daniel, one eyebrow raised. I hope you know what you're doing. I hope so too. Emma came barreling past Mrs. Henderson before any of the adults could stop her, her 8-year-old energy filling the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. Grandpa, why were you so late, Mrs. Henderson made me practice my spelling words twice because she said we had to kill time. And I don't like killing time. It sounds mean. And who is that lady? And why is she wearing your shirt? Daniel caught Emma in his arms and lifted her off the ground, something that was getting harder to do every year as she grew, but that he refused to stop doing until his back gave out entirely. Slow down, one question at a time. This is Victoria. She's a friend who needed some help. She's going to stay in the guest room for a while. Emma wriggled free from his grasp and approached Victoria with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. What kind of help do you need? Are you sick? You don't look sick. Your hair is really pretty. Is that my old Camp Wilderness t-shirt? Victoria knelt down to bring herself to Emma's level, and something in her face softened in a way Daniel had not seen before. Yes, it is your shirt. Your grandfather let me borrow it because mine were all wet. I hope that's okay. It's okay. I don't wear that one anymore anyway because it has a picture of a bear on it. And Tyler Simmons said bears are for babies, which is stupid because bears are actually really scary and could eat Tyler Simmons in like 2 seconds. Daniel caught Mrs. Henderson's eye, and they shared a moment of amusement at Emma's characteristically unfiltered commentary. Emma, why don't you go get ready for school? I'll drive you today. But I want to talk to the lady more. You can talk to her later. She'll be here when you get home. Emma looked at Victoria with an expression of serious consideration that seemed far too mature for her 8 years. Promise you'll still be here because sometimes people say they'll be here later and then they're not. Like my mom and dad, they said they'd pick me up from my friend's house and then they never came because they died. So now I always make sure people promise. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Daniel felt his heart constrict with a familiar pain, the pain of watching his granddaughter navigate a grief that no child should ever have to understand. Victoria's expression shifted, the softness deepening into something that looked like recognition. I promise, Emma, I'll be here when you get home. Emma studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded with the solemn gravity of a judge rendering a verdict. Okay, I believe you. She turned and headed toward the stairs to get ready for school, and Victoria straightened up with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. She needed to hear that you would be here, and I think you needed to say it. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching this exchange with her sharp, assessing gaze, finally spoke. Danny, can I talk to you outside for a moment? They stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind them. The rain had finally begun to let up, but the sky remained gray and heavy, with the promise of more weather to come. You want to tell me what's really going on here? Daniel gave her an abbreviated version of the morning's events, the woman in the diner, the story she had told, the decision he had made to bring her somewhere safe. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. This man she's running from, Richard Blackwell, he sounds dangerous. He is. She showed me some of the messages he sent her, photographs taken without her knowledge, notes appearing in places they shouldn't be able to appear. He's been stalking her for weeks, and she has no idea how he keeps finding her. And you thought bringing her to your house where your 8-year-old granddaughter lives was a good idea. The criticism in her voice was gentle but real, and Daniel felt its weight. I couldn't leave her out there, not in that condition, not knowing what she's up against. I'm not saying you should have left her. I'm saying there might be better options. Shelters, support organizations, people trained to deal with exactly this kind of situation. She's terrified of those places. She thinks he has connections everywhere. She thinks if she goes anywhere official, he'll find out and he'll find her. And she might be right. Men like him often do have connections, but that doesn't mean you can protect her better than the people who do this professionally. Daniel looked out at the rain-soaked street at the neighborhood he had called home for 3 decades. Maybe not, but I can try, and right now trying is all I've got. Mrs. Henderson sighed, a sound that carried decades of experience with people making exactly this kind of decision for exactly this kind of reason. You're a stubborn old fool, Danny Crawford, but you're a good man, and I suppose the world needs stubborn old fools who are also good men. Does that mean you'll help? It means I'll keep my eyes open and my shotgun loaded. That Remington was Jim's, and I know how to use it. Anyone comes around here causing trouble, they'll find out exactly how well I know how to use it. Daniel felt a wave of gratitude for this woman who had been his neighbor and friend for so many years. Thank you, Evelyn. Don't thank me yet. We don't know what we're up against, but whatever it is, we'll face it together. That's what neighbors do. She patted his arm, once a gesture that was as close to affection as Evelyn Henderson ever got, and headed back across the yard to her own house. Daniel stood on the porch for another moment, looking at the sky, at the street, at the life he had built in this place. Then he went back inside to face whatever came next. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small tasks and necessary conversations. Daniel drove Emma to school, answering her endless questions about the lady in the guest room with as much honesty as he could manage, without revealing details that would only frighten or confuse her. Victoria stayed in the house, resting in the guest room, recovering from the physical and emotional exhaustion of the past weeks. By the time Daniel got home from dropping Emma off, it was nearly 9 o'clock. He had missed the morning shift at work, and he knew he would need to call Karen Mitchell, his boss at the construction company, to explain his absence. But that could wait. Right now, there were more pressing concerns. He found Victoria sitting in the living room, curled up in the corner of the couch with her knees drawn up to her chest, looking out the window at the gray morning. How are you feeling? She turned to face him, and he was relieved to see that some of the desperate fear had faded from her eyes. Better. Scared, confused, but better. Good. That's a start. Daniel sat down in the recliner across from her, giving her space while still being close enough for conversation. We need to talk about what comes next, about how we're going to keep you safe and what we're going to do about this man who's been hunting you. Victoria nodded, though her expression tightened at the mention of Richard. I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking that you should probably just take me to a shelter or a bus station or somewhere I can disappear. I don't want to put you or Emma or anyone else at risk. That's not going to happen. Daniel, no, listen to me. Running hasn't worked. Hiding hasn't worked. You've been doing both for weeks, and he keeps finding you. That tells me that whatever you've been doing isn't enough. You need something different. You need people who will stand with you instead of places to hide from him. I don't have people. That's the whole point. He made sure of that. He isolated me from everyone who might have helped, and now I have no one. You have me, and you have Evelyn, and you have whatever friends and neighbors I can round up to stand watch and keep eyes open and make it clear that you're not alone anymore. Victoria shook her head, tears beginning to well in her eyes again. You don't understand. He's not just some jealous ex-boyfriend. He's a monster. He destroys people. He ruins lives. And he enjoys it. He actually enjoys watching people suffer. I've met monsters before. I've looked them in the eye, and I'm still here. This one is no different. How can you be so sure? Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady and certain. Because monsters only have power over people who face them alone. That's how they operate. They isolate their victims. They make them feel helpless and hopeless and utterly without support. But when someone stands up and says no, when a community comes together to protect one of its own, the monster loses its power. It becomes just a man, and men can be beaten. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her expression a complex mixture of hope and disbelief. You really believe that? I do, and I think you want to believe it too. Otherwise, you wouldn't still be here. You would have walked out that door hours ago. She was silent for a while, processing his words, weighing them against the accumulated terror of the past weeks. What do you suggest we do? First, we need information, everything you know about him, everything you've gathered, everything that might help us understand who he is and how he operates. Second, we need allies, people who know about stalking and harassment and how to fight back against it. Lawyers, advocates, maybe even police if we can find ones who will actually listen. Third, we need to make you visible. Not hide you away, but make it clear that you're part of a community that will not tolerate what he's doing. The more people who know what's happening, the harder it will be for him to act without consequences. Victoria absorbed this, her mind clearly working through the implications. I have evidence, documents, emails, photographs. I saved everything I could before I ran. It's all on a flash drive that I keep. She trailed off, her expression troubled. That I had in my bag that I left in the motel room when I ran. Daniel felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression calm. Is there any way to get it back? Not without going back there. And if he knows I'm still in Portland, if he's watching that motel, then we don't go to the motel. We find another way. Daniel stood up and began pacing his mind, working through possibilities. You said you made copies. Is there anywhere else the information might be? Cloud storage, email attachments, anything? Victoria's eyes widened slightly. My email, I sent copies to myself just in case, but I haven't been able to check my email since I left Seattle. I was afraid he was monitoring it. He probably is, but we might be able to access it from somewhere he wouldn't expect. A library computer, a friend's phone, somewhere that can't be traced back to this address. You're thinking like him, anticipating his moves. I'm thinking like someone who wants to stay one step ahead. It's not the same thing. The sound of a car engine in the street made them both freeze. Daniel moved to the window and looked out, his body tense with readiness. But it was just a neighbor driving past, heading to work or errands or whatever ordinary business filled ordinary days. We should probably avoid the windows, Victoria said quietly. Just in case. You're right, let's move to the kitchen. It's in the back of the house, harder to see from the street. They relocated to the kitchen table and Daniel made another pot of coffee while Victoria began to write down everything she could remember about Richard Blackwell. His habits, his patterns, his known associates, the methods he had used to track her in the past. The list grew longer and more disturbing with each passing minute. Richard had resources that went far beyond what a normal person would have. He had connections in law enforcement, in banking, and the tech industry. He had money to hire private investigators and security consultants and lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. He was a lawyer himself, Victoria explained, before he was disbarred. Securities fraud. He got caught running a Ponzi scheme that cost his clients millions of dollars. But somehow he avoided jail time, just lost his license and paid some fines and walked away. That's when he reinvented himself as whatever he is now, a predator who targets vulnerable women. Victoria nodded, her expression bleak. He's good at it, disturbingly good. He knows exactly how to find women who have money but no one to protect them, widows, divorcees, women whose families have died or abandoned them. He swoops in during their darkest moments, presents himself as a savior, and then slowly takes everything they have. And no one has stopped him. No one has tried, or the ones who have tried have failed. I found references to other women in his emails, at least 4 others before me. I don't know what happened to most of them. One name I found in an obituary, suicide. Another name came up in bankruptcy filings. The others, nothing, like they just disappeared. Daniel felt the cold anger in his chest grow colder and more focused. Then we'll be the ones who stop him, whatever it takes. The morning passed into afternoon as they continued to gather information and develop plans. Daniel called Karen Mitchell to explain that he had a family emergency and would need a few days off. She was understanding, as she always was, because Daniel had spent a decade building a reputation as someone who never missed work without a good reason. He called Mrs. Henderson and gave her a fuller picture of the situation, asking her to keep an extra sharp eye on the neighborhood and to let him know immediately if she saw anything unusual. She promised to spread the word among the other neighbors, the network of retirees, and stay-at-home parents who formed the unofficial watch system of the Hawthorne district. By the time Emma came home from school, bouncing through the door with all the energy of an 8-year-old who had been forced to sit still for 6 hours, Daniel and Victoria had begun to build the foundations of a plan. "You're still here," Emma observed, looking at Victoria with an expression of satisfaction. "You kept your promise." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her all day. "I did. I told you I would." Emma dropped her backpack on the floor, ignored Daniel's gesture for her to pick it up, and flopped onto the couch next to Victoria. "What have you been doing all day? Did you watch TV? There's a show I really like about a dog who solves mysteries. It's kind of dumb, but in a good way. Do you want to watch it with me?" Victoria looked at Daniel, uncertain how to respond to this barrage of questions and invitations. "Why don't we all watch it together?" Daniel suggested, "after Emma does her homework." "Ugh, homework. Why do we have to do homework? We already did work at school. That should be enough work." "Because your teachers are cruel and heartless monsters who exist only to torment innocent children." Emma's eyes went wide. "Really?" "No, do your homework." She groaned dramatically but retrieved her backpack and spread her assignments across the coffee table, complaining the whole time about the injustice of the educational system. Victoria watched her with an expression that combined amusement and something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. "She's wonderful," she said quietly to Daniel. "How do you do it? Keep her so normal after everything that's happened?" Daniel thought about the question about the countless small decisions and daily struggles that went into raising a child who had lost both parents before she was old enough to understand what death really meant. "I don't keep her normal. She keeps herself normal. Kids are resilient in ways we adults can barely comprehend. They bend where we would break. All I do is try not to mess up the foundation she's building for herself." Victoria's eyes glistened. "You're a good grandfather." "I'm a tired grandfather, but I'm trying." The evening passed in something approaching normalcy. Emma finished her homework, complained about dinner, watched half an episode of her mystery-solving dog show before declaring that she was bored and wanted to draw instead. She pulled out paper and colored pencils and began working on something with the intense concentration of an artist possessed by a vision. Victoria sat with her, offering occasional comments on her technique, answering an endless stream of questions about what it was like to be a real photographer. Daniel watched them from the kitchen, feeling something warm and hopeful stirring in his chest, despite the danger that lurked somewhere out in the rainy Portland night. At 8 o'clock, he announced that it was time for Emma to get ready for bed. The protests were loud and inventive, but ultimately unsuccessful, and within an hour she was bathed, brushed, and tucked into her bed in the room that had once belonged to her father. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed as he did every night and listened to her prayer, which was as unorthodox as everything else about her. Dear God, thank you for today, and please watch over me and Grandpa and Mrs. Henderson and all my friends at school and Tyler Simmons, even though he's annoying. And please take care of my mom and dad in heaven and tell them I miss them, but I'm okay. And please take care of the lady staying in our guest room because I think she's really sad about something and I want her to not be sad anymore. Amen. Daniel kissed her forehead. That was a good prayer. I added the part about the lady. Is that okay? Is she really sad? She's going through a hard time, but she's going to be okay. We're going to help her. Emma nodded, her expression serious in the dim light of her bedside lamp. Good. That's what Mom used to say we should do. Help people who are sad. Your mom was right. She was right about a lot of things. I know, I remember. Daniel stayed with her until her eyes began to close, then quietly left the room and pulled the door almost shut, leaving it open just a crack the way she liked. He found Victoria sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. She's a remarkable child. She is. She's also exhausted most of my energy and patience on a daily basis, but yes, she's remarkable. Victoria turned away from the window to face him. I've been thinking about what you said, about not hiding, about making myself visible, about standing up instead of running away. And I want to do it. I want to try, but I need you to understand something first. Daniel sat down across from her, giving her his full attention. I've been in survival mode for so long that I've forgotten what anything else feels like. Every decision I've made for the past year has been about getting through the next hour, the next day, the next week without being completely destroyed. I haven't had the luxury of thinking about the future or planning for anything beyond immediate survival. I understand. That's what trauma does. It shrinks your world down until you can only see the next step in front of you. But now you're asking me to think bigger, to trust, to believe that things could actually get better. And I want to do that. I want to believe, but I don't know if I can. Daniel leaned forward, his voice gentle but certain. You don't have to believe right now. You just have to act. Take the next step, even if you can't see where the path leads. Trust not that everything will work out, but that we'll face whatever comes together. That's all anyone can ask. Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, I'll try. That's all I'm asking. The night deepened around them, rain continuing its steady rhythm against the windows, and Daniel felt the familiar tension of waiting for something to happen. The same tension he had felt in the desert 30 years ago, the same tension that had become a permanent part of his psychological landscape. Somewhere out there, Richard Blackwell was looking for Victoria. Somewhere out there, a predator was circling, waiting for the opportunity to strike. And here in this small house on Maple Street, a broken woman and a tired old man were getting ready to make their stand. Daniel did not know what the coming days would bring. He did not know if he could really protect Victoria from the threat that pursued her. He did not know if his plan to bring the community together would work or if it would only put more people in danger. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to stand by and watch another person be destroyed by someone who used power to prey on the vulnerable. He was not going to let the promise he had made to Rachel become meaningless words. He was going to fight, and whatever happened next, he was not going to fight alone. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that combined the ordinary routines of daily life with the extraordinary tension of living under siege. Victoria remained at the house on Maple Street, slowly beginning to recover from the physical and emotional exhaustion of her weeks on the run. She helped with housework, offered to cook meals, and spent hours talking with Emma about art and photography and the hundreds of random questions that poured out of an 8-year-old mind. Daniel went back to work, but with a new alertness that never fully relaxed. He watched the streets around the job site for unfamiliar cars. He kept his phone close at all times, ready to respond to any message from Mrs. Henderson or the other neighbors who had agreed to keep watch. He came home earlier than usual each evening, unwilling to leave Victoria and Emma alone longer than necessary. Mrs. Henderson organized the neighborhood watch with military precision, drawing on skills she had developed decades ago, coordinating medical evacuations under fire. She established shifts and communication protocols, identified the best vantage points for observing the street, and made sure that every house on the block had at least one person aware of the situation and ready to respond. "We're not vigilantes," she explained to Daniel during one of their evening briefings. "We're witnesses. If this man shows up, the most important thing we can do is document everything. Photographs, video, license plate numbers, descriptions, evidence that can be used if things go to court. And if he tries something before the courts get involved." Mrs. Henderson's smile was thin and cold. "Then I've got Jim's Remington and I remember exactly how to use it." On the fourth day, Daniel took Victoria to the downtown library to access her email from a public computer. They arrived separately, meeting in a quiet corner of the reading room, and Victoria logged in with hands that trembled slightly, despite her attempts to appear calm. Her inbox was flooded with messages, most of them from email addresses she did not recognize. Spam, probably. Or worse, phishing attempts from Richard or his associates trying to track her location through digital breadcrumbs. But buried among the noise were the messages she had sent to herself, the digital lifeline she had created before fleeing Seattle. She forwarded them to a new secure email address that Daniel had helped her create, then quickly logged out and wiped the browser history. "Did you get everything?" Victoria nodded, relief evident in her face. "Everything I had. Emails, documents, photographs. It's not as much as I would like, but it's something. It's a start." They left the library separately, reuniting at Daniel's truck 3 blocks away, and drove home through streets that seemed to hold shadows in every corner. That evening, they spread the documents across the kitchen table and began to build a case. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than Daniel had anticipated. Richard Blackwell had been running his scheme for at least 7 years. There were references to at least 6 women before Victoria, all of them fitting the same profile: wealthy, isolated, vulnerable. 2 were dead, one from suicide, and one from what the coroner had ruled an accidental drug overdose. 3 more had lost everything, their finances destroyed, their reputations ruined, their ability to fight back systematically dismantled. One had simply disappeared, her name appearing in Richard's emails and then vanishing entirely from any searchable record. "He's careful," Daniel observed, studying the timeline they had constructed. "He never does anything that would create clear evidence of criminal activity. Everything he does is technically legal, or at least unprovable. Manipulation isn't a crime. Neither is taking advantage of someone's trust. But stalking is. Harassment is. Breaking into a motel room to photograph someone while they sleep is definitely a crime. Do you have proof that he did that photographs witnesses?" Victoria's face fell. "Just my word against his. And he has lawyers who specialize in making people's words disappear." Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind working through the problem. "Then we need to create evidence. We need to catch him in the act of doing something that can't be explained away. Something that will force the police to take action. How? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." The next morning brought an unexpected development. Daniel was drinking his coffee in the kitchen when Mrs. Henderson knocked on the back door, her expression grim. "There was a car parked on the street last night. Black sedan, tinted windows. I noticed it around 11 and watched it for almost 2 hours before it finally drove away." Daniel felt the tension in his chest tighten. "Did you get a license plate?" "Better, I got photographs." She handed him her phone, and Daniel scrolled through a series of images that showed a dark vehicle mostly obscured by shadows and rain, but with enough detail to make out the make and model. A BM new and expensive with Oregon plates that were partially visible in one shot. "I'm going to have my nephew run these plates. He works for the DMV. Technically, he's not supposed to use the database for personal purposes, but he owes me a favor from when I helped him through his divorce." Daniel looked at this 78-year-old woman with her gray hair and her reading glasses and her encyclopedic knowledge of how to work the system and felt a surge of gratitude. "Evelyn, you're amazing." "I know. I also baked some cookies. Figured you all could use some comfort food." She handed him a tin that smelled of chocolate and warmth, and Daniel had never been more certain that his neighborhood was worth fighting for. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere in the house had begun to shift. Victoria was sleeping better, eating more, starting to engage with the world again after weeks of existing in pure survival mode. She and Emma had developed an easy rapport, the older woman and the young girl finding common ground in their shared love of art and their mutual experience of loss. One evening, Daniel came home to find them sitting together at the kitchen table, both bent over sheets of paper, Emma with her colored pencils, and Victoria with a camera taking photographs of Emma's drawings. "What's going on here?" Emma looked up with a grin. "Victoria is going to put my drawings in a real gallery. She says they're good enough." Daniel looked at Victoria, who shrugged with a smile that was becoming more frequent and less forced. "She has real talent. I've seen professional artists with less natural ability, and when I open my gallery again, assuming I ever get my life back together enough to do it, I want to showcase emerging artists. Why not start with Emma?" "I'm an emerging artist," Emma announced with evident pride. "I'm emerging." "You certainly are." The doorbell rang, and Daniel felt the familiar spike of tension that accompanied any unexpected visitor. He went to answer it, his body automatically shifting into a more defensive posture, and found a woman he did not recognize standing on his porch. She was around 40, professionally dressed with sharp eyes that assessed him quickly and thoroughly. "Daniel Crawford." "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm an attorney. I specialize in cases involving domestic violence and stalking. I believe you have a client for me." Daniel stared at her, trying to process this unexpected arrival. "How did you find us?" "Mrs. Henderson. She and I served on a nonprofit board together about 10 years ago. She called me this morning and told me she had a situation that might interest me." Of course, Evelyn had found a lawyer. Daniel was beginning to believe that Mrs. Henderson could solve any problem if given enough time and motivation. "Come in, please." He led Margaret into the living room where Victoria had appeared in the doorway, her expression wary. "Victoria, this is Margaret Sullivan. She's an attorney who specializes in your kind of situation." Margaret's eyes moved to Victoria and her professional demeanor softened slightly. "Miss Harrington, I've heard a summary of what you're dealing with. I want to help if you'll let me." Victoria looked at Daniel, then at Margaret, then back at Daniel. He could see her struggling with the instinct to run, to hide, to trust no one. "How do I know you're not working for him?" Margaret's expression did not change. "You don't. You can't know for certain. Trust has to start somewhere, and you're going to have to make a choice about whether to extend it or not. What I can tell you is that I've spent 20 years of my career fighting for women in situations exactly like yours. I've won more cases than I've lost, and I'm not interested in making money off your suffering. If you can't pay, we'll figure something out. This isn't about money for me, it's about stopping predators." Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay, let's talk." They talked for 3 hours, Margaret taking notes while Victoria recounted every detail of her relationship with Richard Blackwell, every instance of manipulation and control and harassment that she could remember. Daniel sat in the corner listening, his anger building with each new revelation. When they finished, Margaret looked over her notes with a frown. "You have a lot of evidence, but most of it is circumstantial. Nothing that would be easy to prosecute. He's been very careful." "That's what I was afraid of." "However," Margaret continued, "the fact that he's been following you, that he's been entering your hotel rooms without permission, that he's been leaving messages and photographs, those are clear violations of stalking laws. If we can document them, if we can catch him in the act, we can file for a restraining order. And if he violates the restraining order, that's criminal behavior that even his fancy lawyers won't be able to explain away. So we need to catch him. Yes, and we need to do it in a way that's legally admissible. That means no entrapment, no illegal surveillance, nothing that a good defense attorney could use to throw out the evidence." Daniel leaned forward. "What would you suggest?" Margaret thought for a moment. "We make it easy for him. We create an opportunity for him to do what he's been doing, but this time we're watching. We're recording and we're ready." "You mean using Victoria as bait?" "I mean using Victoria's presence as an opportunity to gather evidence. There's a difference. She doesn't have to do anything dangerous. She just has to be visible, to exist. And we watch to see how he responds." Victoria's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I'll do it, whatever it takes to end this." Daniel looked at her, saw the determination that had replaced the desperation, and felt something that might have been pride. "Then let's make a plan." The plan took shape over the next several days, with Margaret Sullivan coordinating the legal aspects, while Daniel and Mrs. Henderson organized the practical elements. They chose their moment carefully, selecting a day when Victoria would make a visible appearance at a public location, somewhere Richard would be likely to spot her if he was watching. The location they chose was a farmer's market in the Pearl District, a busy weekend event that attracted hundreds of visitors and offered plenty of witnesses and escape routes. Victoria would walk through the market seemingly alone, while Daniel and several volunteers from the neighborhood watched from strategic positions, ready to document any approach by Richard or his associates. Remember, Margaret instructed them during the final briefing, we're not trying to confront him. We're not trying to catch him in a physical altercation. We just want evidence of him stalking her, following her, taking photographs, anything that shows a pattern of harassment. And if he tries to approach her directly, then Victoria walks away, quickly and publicly, and we document that too. The morning of the operation was clear and bright, the first sunny day Portland had seen in weeks. Daniel drove Victoria to a parking lot 3 blocks from the market, and they walked the rest of the way together, maintaining a careful distance that allowed them to appear unconnected while staying close enough to communicate. The market was crowded, as they had hoped. Vendors sold fresh produce and homemade crafts and artisanal foods from colorful tents, and tables and shoppers moved through the aisles in a constant shifting flow of humanity. Victoria moved through the crowd with a calm that Daniel could tell was hard-won. She stopped at various booths, examined merchandise, exchanged pleasantries with vendors, playing the role of a woman enjoying a normal Saturday morning at the market. Daniel watched from a position near a coffee stand, pretending to study his phone while his eyes constantly scanned the crowd. He spotted Mrs. Henderson near the east entrance, George Palmer by the fountain, and 2 other neighbors positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. For the first hour, nothing happened. Victoria completed 2 circuits of the market, and Daniel began to wonder if they had guessed wrong, if Richard was not watching as closely as they had assumed. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Henderson. Black BMW, same plates, parked on Gleason. Daniel felt adrenaline spike through his system. He typed back quickly. Any sign of the driver? Not yet, I'm watching. He looked toward Victoria, who was examining some pottery at a booth near the north end of the market. She seemed relaxed, but he knew the tension coiling beneath her calm exterior. His phone buzzed again. Man exiting vehicle, tall gray hair, expensive clothes, moving toward market. Daniel typed a message to Victoria. He's here, stay calm, keep moving naturally. He watched her check her phone, saw her posture stiffen, almost imperceptibly, then relax as she continued to browse the pottery booth. The next few minutes were some of the longest of Daniel's life. He moved through the market, always keeping Victoria in sight, watching for the figure that Mrs. Henderson had described. The crowds made it difficult to spot anyone at a distance, but finally he saw him. Richard Blackwell was exactly as Victoria had described. Tall and distinguished looking, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He wore expensive casual clothing that somehow managed to look both relaxed and predatory, and his eyes were fixed on Victoria with an intensity that made Daniel's skin crawl. He was following her. Not closely, not obviously, but definitely following. Stopping when she stopped. Moving when she moved. Maintaining a distance that would appear innocent to a casual observer, but that Victoria would surely feel if she turned around. Daniel lifted his phone and began taking photographs. Across the market, he could see George Palmer doing the same and Mrs. Henderson moving to a better angle. For 20 minutes, they documented Richard's stalking behavior. Every pause, every lingering look, every adjustment of his position to keep Victoria in view. By the time Victoria completed her final circuit and headed toward the exit, they had dozens of photographs and several minutes of video. Daniel felt a grim satisfaction building in his chest. They had what they needed. Evidence that Richard Blackwell was not just a jilted ex-boyfriend, but a stalker who crossed state lines to follow his victim and surveilled her in public spaces. Victoria left the market and walked toward the predetermined meeting point, a small park 2 blocks away. Daniel followed at a distance, watching to see if Richard would continue his pursuit. He did. The older man moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his eyes never leaving Victoria, his path adjusting smoothly to maintain visual contact. But when Victoria turned onto the side street that led to the park, Richard suddenly stopped. He stood at the corner, watching her walk away, his expression unreadable. Then without warning, he turned and looked directly at Daniel. Their eyes met across 50 feet of sidewalk and strangers. Richard's face was a mask of calm, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been amusement or anger or simply acknowledgement. He knows, Daniel thought. He knows we were watching. Richard held his gaze for a long moment, a challenge and a warning wrapped in a single look. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and headed for the park. He found Victoria sitting on a bench, her composure finally beginning to crack now that she was away from public scrutiny. He was there, wasn't he? I could feel him watching. He was there, and we got everything. Photographs, video, multiple witnesses. Margaret will have enough to file for that restraining order first thing Monday morning. Victoria nodded, but her face was still pale. He looked at you. At the end. I saw it. He wanted me to know that he knew, that we weren't as clever as we thought. Aren't you scared? Daniel thought about the question, about the cold eyes that had met his across the crowded street, about the certainty he had felt that Richard Blackwell was exactly as dangerous as Victoria had warned. Yes, he said honestly. I am, but I was scared in Kuwait too, and I survived that. Fear doesn't mean you stop fighting. It just means you're paying attention. Mrs. Henderson and George Palmer arrived a few minutes later, comparing notes and photographs, their faces flushed with the excitement of successful reconnaissance. We got him, George announced with satisfaction. Clear as day. That man was following Victoria for at least 40 minutes. No way to explain that away as coincidence. Mrs. Henderson nodded. I've already sent copies to Margaret. She's going to review everything tonight and start preparing the paperwork. Daniel looked at the group gathered around the park bench, at these ordinary people who had come together to protect a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Thank you, all of you. I know this isn't your fight, and I know it comes with risks. But what you did today matters. It might be the thing that finally stops him. George shrugged. We're neighbors, Danny. That's what neighbors do. Besides, I haven't had this much excitement since I retired. Beats the hell out of watching daytime television. They dispersed slowly, heading to their cars, returning to their normal lives, carrying with them the knowledge that they had done something important. Daniel drove Victoria home, both of them silent for most of the journey, processing the events of the morning. Finally, as they pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, Victoria spoke. It's really happening. After all this time, something is actually happening. It's happening. It's not over yet, not by a long shot, but it's happening. And every step forward is one step closer to the end. Do you really believe that? Daniel turned off the engine and looked at her, at this woman who had been broken and hunted and stripped of everything she thought defined her, and who was now beginning to find the strength to fight back. I believe that you deserve to live without fear. I believe that Richard Blackwell deserves to face consequences for what he's done. And I believe that if we keep fighting, keep documenting, keep building the case, eventually the truth will come out. That's not optimism. That's just how justice works when enough people are willing to fight for it. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you for everything, for the house and the help and the community you've built around me. I was ready to give up that morning in the diner. I was ready to just disappear. And you gave me a plate of eggs and changed everything. Daniel smiled, the first real smile he had felt in days. That's what people do for each other. At least that's what people should do. And I figure if the world isn't the way it should be, the only way to fix it is to act like it is anyway. Keep doing the right thing until the right thing becomes normal. They got out of the truck and walked toward the house, where Emma was already visible in the window, watching for their return with the anxious energy of a child who knew something important was happening, but did not fully understand what. Daniel paused at the door, looking back at the street, at the quiet neighborhood that had become a fortress, at the blue sky that seemed to promise better days ahead. Something was coming. Richard Blackwell would not simply accept defeat and walk away. The war was not over. It was just beginning. But for the first time since Victoria had walked into Rosie's diner, Daniel felt something that he recognized as hope. Not hope that everything would be easy, but hope that whatever came next, they would face it together. and together they just might win. The next week brought both progress and escalation. Margaret Sullivan filed for an emergency restraining order on Monday morning, presenting the evidence gathered at the farmer's market, along with Victoria's documented history with Richard Blackwell. The judge, impressed by the thoroughness of the case, granted a temporary order that prohibited Richard from coming within 500 feet of Victoria, her residence, or her place of work. It was a victory, but Daniel knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Restraining orders were pieces of paper. They could not stop a determined predator. They could only provide legal consequences if that predator chose to ignore them. Richard's response came 3 days later, not through any illegal action, but through the legal system he had learned to manipulate so well. His attorneys filed a counter motion claiming that Victoria had fabricated the evidence and was engaged in a campaign of harassment against their client. They demanded that the restraining order be overturned and suggested that Victoria should be investigated for making false accusations. Margaret Sullivan was unsurprised and undeterred. "This is exactly what I expected. He's trying to flip the narrative, make himself the victim. It's a common tactic among abusers with resources. But it won't work. We have too much documentation, too many witnesses, too much evidence of a pattern of behavior that goes back years. What do we do now? We fight, we respond to every filing counter, every claim, build our case piece by piece until it's so overwhelming that no judge could possibly dismiss it. This isn't going to be quick or easy, but we're going to win." Daniel believed her, but he also knew that Richard Blackwell was not the kind of man who relied solely on legal maneuvers to get what he wanted. The first sign of escalation came on Friday evening. Daniel returned home from work to find Emma upset and Victoria trying to calm her down. What happened? Victoria's face was pale. Someone delivered flowers to Emma's school with her name on the card. Daniel felt his blood run cold. What kind of flowers? White lilies. The card said, "Thinking of you," with no signature. White lilies, the same flowers Richard had sent to Victoria's motel rooms before her disappearance. The same flowers that appeared in photographs Richard had taken of his previous victims. He was sending a message, letting them know that he could reach Emma, that their protection was not as complete as they believed. Daniel took several deep breaths, forcing his rage down to a manageable level. Losing control would not help anyone. "Did the school keep the card, the flowers?" Victoria nodded. "I told them not to throw anything away. And I called Margaret. She's going to add this to the harassment file." "Did anyone see who delivered them?" "A florist. They said it was a phone order paid with a prepaid credit card. No way to trace it." Of course. Richard was too smart to leave an easy trail. Daniel went to Emma, who was sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller and more frightened than he had seen her in months. "Hey, Pumpkin, are you okay?" Emma's eyes were red from crying. "Who sent me flowers? Why did someone I don't know send me flowers? Victoria said they were from a bad man. Is it the man who's trying to hurt her? Is he trying to hurt me too?" Daniel sat beside her and pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body tremble against his. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Ever. That's a promise." "But how can you stop him if he knows where my school is, if he can send things to me there?" It was a good question, a terrifying question. The kind of question that should never have to cross the mind of an 8-year-old child. "Because I'm not alone. We have Mrs. Henderson and all our neighbors watching out for us. We have Margaret the lawyer building a case that's going to put this man away. We have people everywhere who care about you and want to keep you safe. One bad man against all of us, he doesn't stand a chance." Emma looked up at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe. "You promise?" "I promise. Now here's what I need you to do. From now on, if anyone you don't know tries to talk to you or give you anything or get you to go somewhere with them, you run. You run to a teacher or a police officer or any adult you trust and you tell them what happened. Can you do that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I can do that." "Good girl. That's my brave girl." He held her for a long time, feeling the weight of her trust and the burden of his responsibility. Somewhere out there, Richard Blackwell was watching, planning, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And Daniel had just discovered that even the people he loved most were not beyond the predator's reach. That night, after Emma was asleep and Victoria had retreated to the guest room, Daniel sat in the darkness of the living room thinking. The flowers were a test, a demonstration. Richard wanted them to know that he could reach into their lives whenever he chose, that the restraining order meant nothing to him, that he was in control. But Daniel had spent years studying structures, understanding how things were built and how they could be torn down. And he knew that every system had weaknesses. Every predator made mistakes. Every pattern could be disrupted if you found the right point of leverage. Richard Blackwell was confident. He was experienced. He had gotten away with his crimes for years, but he was also arrogant, and arrogance bred carelessness. Somewhere in his plans, there was a flaw, a vulnerability, a crack that could be exploited. Daniel was going to find it. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Margaret Sullivan. "We need to talk, tomorrow. It's time to stop playing defense." The reply came minutes later. "I'll be there at 9. Daniel set down the phone and stared into the darkness, his mind already working through possibilities, strategies, ways to turn the tables on a man who believed himself untouchable. The war was escalating. But Daniel had learned something in Kuwait that had stayed with him for 30 years. When you're fighting a superior force, you don't win by matching their strength. You win by changing the terms of the battle, by making them fight on terrain they don't expect, by being willing to sacrifice everything for the chance of victory. Richard Blackwell thought he was hunting a defenseless woman. He was about to discover that he had cornered something much more dangerous, a community that refused to be afraid. The meeting with Margaret Sullivan the next morning marked a turning point in their strategy. Daniel laid out his thinking, while Victoria and Mrs. Henderson listened, their faces reflecting varying degrees of concern and determination. "He's been controlling the tempo of this fight since the beginning. We react to what he does. We defend against his attacks. We document his violations, but never actually stop them. That has to change." Margaret nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" "We go on offense. We don't just wait for him to violate the restraining order and document it after the fact. We actively investigate him. We find the other victims, the women he's destroyed before Victoria. We build a case so comprehensive that even his expensive lawyers can't get him out of it. That would require resources, time, money, things we don't have in abundance. Then we find them. There must be others out there who want to stop him as badly as we do. Former victims, law enforcement who tried and failed to make charges stick, journalists who've looked into his activities. We find them, we bring them together, and we create a coalition that's bigger than anything he's faced before." Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "My nephew at the DMV. He ran those license plates for me. It turns out Richard Blackwell has accumulated quite a few parking tickets in Portland over the past several months. He's been here longer than we realized. Watching, planning. That's exactly the kind of information we need. Small details that reveal patterns. Movement data that shows he's been stalking Victoria long before she even knew she was being followed." Victoria, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "There's something I haven't told you. Something I found in Richard's files before I ran." Everyone turned to look at her. Names, a list of names with dates and dollar amounts. "I thought it was just a record of his victims, but some of the entries didn't have dollar amounts. They had symbols, stars and crosses and question marks. I didn't know what they meant at the time, but I've been thinking about it, and I wonder." "You wonder what?" "What if the stars were victims he successfully exploited? The crosses were ones who died, and the question marks were targets he was still considering." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you remember any of the names?" "Some of them. I wrote down as many as I could before I ran. They're in the documents I saved." Margaret was already reaching for her briefcase. "We need to cross-reference those names with public records, death certificates, bankruptcy filings, police reports. If we can establish a pattern, if we can show that Richard Blackwell has been systematically destroying women for years, even the most sympathetic judge would have to take action." The investigation that followed consumed the next several weeks. Daniel split his time between work caring for Emma and hunting for information about Richard Blackwell's past victims. Margaret Sullivan used her legal resources to track down public records. Mrs. Henderson coordinated with her network of former colleagues and acquaintances, an impressive web of connections built over decades of community involvement. One by one, the pieces began to fall into place. They found Diana Wells in Montana living in a cabin in the mountains, her life reduced to almost nothing after her encounter with Richard 7 years earlier. She was initially reluctant to speak, traumatized by memories she had spent years trying to bury. But when Daniel traveled to meet her in person, when he showed her the evidence they had gathered and explained that Victoria might be the last victim if they could stop Richard, now she agreed to share her story. They found Patricia Kim in California, rebuilding her life after losing everything, including custody of her children, in the aftermath of her relationship with Richard. She had tried to go to the police years ago, but without enough evidence, her case had gone nowhere. She wept when Margaret explained that they might finally be able to bring Richard to justice. They even found traces of Caroline Marsh, the woman who had died supposedly by suicide 2 years after becoming involved with Richard. Her sister, still grieving, still convinced that Caroline's death was not what it appeared, provided access to documents and correspondence that suggested Richard had driven Caroline to the edge and then watched her fall. The case against Richard Blackwell grew thicker by the day. Email chains, financial records, testimony from witnesses who had seen his true nature emerge behind closed doors. A pattern of behavior that stretched back more than a decade and left broken lives in its wake. But Richard was not idle while they built their case. His lawyers continued their counteroffensive, filing motion after motion, demanding that the restraining order be lifted, accusing Victoria and her supporters of conspiracy and defamation. And more troublingly, the small acts of harassment continued. More flowers delivered to Emma's school, anonymous letters sent to Daniel's workplace suggesting that he was harboring a dangerous criminal. A social media campaign that painted Victoria as an unstable woman, making false accusations against an innocent man. The pressure was relentless, designed to exhaust and demoralize, to make them question whether the fight was worth continuing. But Daniel had made a promise. To Rachel, to Victoria, to Emma, to himself, and he was not going to break it. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the flowers incident and 2 days before Thanksgiving. Daniel was driving home from work, his mind occupied with the details of the legal case and the plans for the holiday, when his phone rang. It was Mrs. Henderson, and her voice was shaking. "Danny, you need to come home. Right now, Hubba." "What happened? Is Emma okay?" "Emma's fine, she's with me. But there's a man at your house, a man talking to Victoria. I saw him through the window when I went to check on things. He's inside, Danny, he got inside." Daniel pressed the accelerator to the floor, the truck's engine roaring as he raced through the evening traffic. "Did you call the police?" "They're on their way. But Danny, it's him, I'm sure of it. The man from the farmer's market, Richard Blackwell." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles went white. Richard had crossed the line. He had violated the restraining order. He had entered Daniel's home. "Keep Emma with you. Don't let her anywhere near the house. I'll be there in 5 minutes." "Danny, be careful. He's dangerous." "I know, that's what I'm counting on." He made the drive in 4 minutes, pushing through yellow lights and cutting corners in ways that would have terrified him under normal circumstances. When he pulled onto Maple Street, he saw the police cruiser parked in front of his house, lights flashing, and felt a complex mixture of relief and fear. 2 officers were at the door speaking with someone inside. Daniel parked his truck and was moving toward the house before the engine had fully stopped. "That's my house. What's happening?" One of the officers turned to face him. "Sir, there's a situation inside. We're handling it." "Is Victoria okay, the woman who's staying with me?" "She's unharmed. We're asking the male subject to leave the premises. He claims he's an acquaintance who was invited inside." "That's a lie. He's violating a restraining order. He's not supposed to be within 500 feet of her." The officer's expression sharpened. "You have documentation of this restraining order?" "It's inside, in a folder on the kitchen counter. Victoria Harrington versus Richard Blackwell, signed by a judge 2 weeks ago." The officer turned to his partner and said something Daniel could not hear. Then they both entered the house, and Daniel followed before anyone could tell him not to. The scene in the living room would stay with him for the rest of his life. Victoria stood against the far wall, her face pale but her expression defiant. Richard Blackwell sat calmly on the couch, legs crossed, a small smile on his lips, looking for all the world like a man who had simply stopped by for a pleasant visit. "Ah, Mr. Crawford, we finally meet properly. I've heard so much about you." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Get out of my house." I was just leaving. Victoria and I were having a lovely conversation about old times. It seems there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of our relationship. There's no misunderstanding. You're a stalker and an abuser, and you're violating a court order by being here. Officers, arrest this man. The officers looked at Richard, then at Victoria, then at the folder one of them had retrieved from the kitchen. Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to need you to come with us. Richard's smile never wavered. Of course, officers. I'm happy to cooperate, though I assure you this is all a terrible mistake. They handcuffed him anyway, reading him his rights, while he maintained an expression of amused tolerance. As they led him past Daniel, Richard paused and spoke in a voice too low for the officers to hear. You think you've won something here. You haven't. This is just the beginning. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. You're right. It is the beginning. The beginning of the end, for you. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a momentary crack in the confident facade. Then the officers pulled him forward and out the door, and he was gone. Daniel turned to Victoria, who had begun to shake now that the immediate danger was past. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? No, he didn't touch me. He just talked. Told me all the things he was going to do to me once this was over. To you, to Emma. He wanted me to know that nothing could stop him, that he always wins. Not this time. This time he's going to lose. Daniel pulled her into a hug, feeling her tremble against his chest. Outside, he could hear the police car pulling away, taking Richard Blackwell to a holding cell where he would spend the night before being arraigned on charges of violating a restraining order. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start, and tomorrow they would continue building the case that would bring Richard Blackwell down once and for all. The Thanksgiving holiday passed in a strange mixture of celebration and vigilance. Margaret Sullivan worked through the holiday weekend, adding the restraining order violation to their growing file of evidence. Mrs. Henderson organized a neighborhood watch rotation that ensured someone was always watching the house on Maple Street, and Daniel, Victoria, and Emma tried to create some semblance of normalcy, sharing a turkey dinner and counting their blessings while a storm gathered strength around them. Richard Blackwell was released on bail the day after Thanksgiving. His lawyers argued that the entry into Daniel's home was a misunderstanding, that Victoria had invited him in, that the restraining order was based on fabricated evidence. The judge was skeptical, but allowed the release, setting a court date for the following month. Daniel had expected this, he had prepared for it, and he had no intention of waiting for the legal system to deliver justice at its own glacial pace. In the weeks following the arrest, the coalition Daniel had built went into overdrive. Diana Wells traveled from Montana to provide testimony. Patricia Kim submitted a written statement from California. Caroline Marsh's sister connected Margaret with a private investigator who had been looking into Richard's activities for years. The evidence mounted. Financial records showing systematic exploitation, testimony from women whose lives had been destroyed, documentation of a pattern of behavior that spanned more than a decade and left ruin in its wake. And finally, 2 weeks before Christmas, Margaret Sullivan called Daniel with news that changed everything. The FBI is interested. They've been building a case against Blackwell for years, but they never had enough cooperative witnesses to make it stick. What we've gathered, the network we've built, it's exactly what they needed. They're taking over the investigation. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a tension that had been building for months, finally beginning to release. What does this mean for Victoria, for us? It means you are not alone anymore. The full resources of federal law enforcement are going to be directed at Richard Blackwell. Wire fraud, mail fraud, interstate stalking, maybe even conspiracy to commit murder, if we can connect him to Caroline Marsh's death. He's facing the rest of his life in prison if they can make even half of these charges stick. And in the meantime, increased protection, federal agents watching the house. Victoria moved to a secure location until the trial. Everything necessary to keep all of you safe until Richard Blackwell is behind bars where he belongs. Daniel relayed the news to Victoria that evening, watching her face cycle through disbelief, hope, and finally something that looked almost like relief. It's really happening, after everything, after all this time. Someone is actually going to stop him. We stopped him, you stopped him, by refusing to give up, by standing your ground when everything in you wanted to run. That took more courage than most people ever have to find in their entire lives. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them. You gave me that courage. You and Emma and Mrs. Henderson and everyone who stood with me when I had no one else. I didn't do this alone. No, you didn't. And that's the point, isn't it? That's what he could never understand. He thought he could isolate you, break you down, make you so alone that you would have no choice but to submit. But he underestimated the power of people who actually care about each other, who stand together when things get hard, who refuse to let each other fall. Daniel looked out the window at the street where he had lived for 30 years, at the neighborhood that had rallied around a stranger in need, at the community that had proven itself stronger than any predator. Rachel used to say that helping someone is like lending them your sunshine. You give them some of your light, and it helps them find their way. But she was wrong about one thing. You don't actually give anything away. The light you share comes back to you multiplied. It grows every time it passes from one person to another, until eventually it's bright enough to chase away any darkness. Emma appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. "Grandpa, are we safe now? Did the bad man go away?" Daniel opened his arms and Emma ran into them, her small body warm against his chest. "The bad man is going away, and yes, we're safe. We're going to be safe now. Because of the helpers, the people who helped us fight. Yes, because of the helpers. Because even when things look impossible, there are always people willing to stand up and do the right thing. And when enough of them come together, they can stop anything." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and wriggled free to return to whatever game she had been playing. Daniel watched her go, then turned back to Victoria. "It's not over. There's still a trial, still months of legal proceedings, still uncertainty about how everything will turn out. But the hardest part is behind us. We made it through." Victoria reached out and took his hand. "We made it through. Together." Outside, the winter sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The longest night of the year was approaching, but Daniel knew that beyond it, the days would start to grow longer again. Light would return, spring would come, and whatever the future held, he and his unlikely family would face it the same way they had faced everything else. Together. The federal investigation brought a sense of security that Daniel had not felt in months, but it also brought complications none of them had anticipated. Richard Blackwell's lawyers responded to the FBI's involvement with a barrage of legal maneuvers designed to delay, obfuscate, and intimidate. They filed motions challenging every piece of evidence. They demanded depositions from every witness. They threatened defamation suits against anyone who spoke publicly about their client. And then 3 days after Christmas, they launched their most devastating attack yet. Daniel was at work when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The woman on the other end identified herself as Sandra Chen from Child Protective Services, and she wanted to schedule a home visit to assess Emma's living situation. The blood drained from Daniel's face as he listened to her explain that an anonymous complaint had been filed, alleging that Emma was being exposed to dangerous individuals in an unstable home environment. The complaint specifically mentioned Victoria's presence in the household and suggested that Daniel was prioritizing a romantic relationship over his granddaughter's welfare. Daniel's voice was steady when he responded, though his hands were shaking. He understood that CPS had a job to do, and he would cooperate fully with any investigation. He provided the contact information for Margaret Sullivan and suggested that Ms. Chen might want to review the ongoing federal case against the individual most likely responsible for the anonymous complaint. When he hung up, he sat in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, feeling the walls closing in around him. Richard Blackwell had found a new weapon. He could not reach Victoria directly anymore, not with federal agents watching. So he was attacking through Emma, through the system designed to protect children, through Daniel's greatest vulnerability. The home visit was scheduled for the following week. Daniel spent every spare moment preparing, cleaning the house until it gleamed, organizing documents that proved his fitness as a guardian, gathering character references from neighbors and teachers and anyone who could testify to the stable, loving environment he had created for Emma. Victoria offered to move out to remove the excuse Richard was using to justify the complaint. Daniel refused. Running away was exactly what Richard wanted. It would be an admission that his accusations had merit. It would give him power over their lives. And it would teach Emma the wrong lesson about how to handle bullies. Mrs. Henderson, when she heard about the CPS investigation, responded with characteristic directness. She marched over to Daniel's house with a folder full of documents, her jaw set with determination. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating bureaucratic systems and refused to be intimidated by them. She had prepared a statement detailing her observations of Daniel's parenting over the past 3 years. She had gathered similar statements from 6 other neighbors. She had even contacted Emma's school and obtained a letter from her teacher, praising Emma's academic performance and emotional well-being. Daniel looked at the folder at the evidence of a community rallying around him and felt his throat tighten with emotion. The home visit itself was anticlimactic. Sandra Chen arrived on a gray January morning, clipboard in hand, professional demeanor firmly in place. She toured the house, interviewed Daniel, and Victoria separately spent time talking with Emma alone and reviewed the mountain of documentation that Daniel had prepared. When she finished, her expression had softened considerably. She explained that she could see no evidence supporting the allegations in the complaint. The home was clean and well-maintained and clearly focused on Emma's needs. Victoria's presence appeared to be temporary and appropriate, with no indication of the instability the complaint had alleged. She would be recommending that the case be closed. Daniel thanked her, and then, because he could not help himself, he asked if she could tell him anything about who had filed the complaint. Sandra's expression became guarded. She explained that complaints were confidential and she could not share that information. But something in her eyes suggested she understood exactly what was happening, exactly who was weaponizing the system designed to protect children. After she left, Daniel sat in the living room, relief and anger warring in his chest. They had survived another attack. But the attacks kept coming, each one designed to exhaust and demoralize, to make them question whether the fight was worth continuing. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face troubled. She asked if the lady from the government was going to take her away. Daniel pulled her into his arms and held her tight. He promised that no one was going to take her anywhere. She was his granddaughter and she belonged with him, and nothing in the world was going to change that. Emma's voice was small against his chest. She said she knew that. She trusted him. But she wished the bad man would just stop. She wished he would leave them alone so they could be a normal family again. Daniel stroked her hair and made a silent promise. Not to her, but to himself. This would end. One way or another, Richard Blackwell's reign of terror would come to an end. And when it did, Emma would finally have the peace she deserved. The federal investigation progressed slowly through January and into February. Agents interviewed victims across multiple states. Financial records were subpoenaed. A picture emerged of a man who had spent more than a decade systematically targeting and destroying vulnerable women, accumulating wealth through manipulation, while leaving a trail of ruined lives in his wake. Margaret Sullivan kept Daniel informed of the developments, though much of the investigation remained confidential. The evidence was overwhelming, she told him. Richard Blackwell was facing charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. It was only a matter of time before the indictment came down. But time, Daniel was learning, was a luxury they could not afford. Richard's harassment continued despite the federal scrutiny. He was careful now, operating through proxies and anonymous channels, never doing anything that could be directly traced back to him. More complaints to CPS, all eventually dismissed. Negative reviews appearing online for Daniel's construction company, all from accounts created days earlier. Whisper campaigns in the neighborhood suggesting that Daniel was involved in something dangerous, something that put everyone at risk. The community held firm. Mrs. Henderson organized a counter-campaign, rallying neighbors to leave positive reviews and speak publicly about Daniel's character. George Palmer confronted the source of one rumor and traced it back to a private investigator who had been asking questions around the neighborhood. The investigator disappeared after George made clear that his activities were being documented and would be reported to the police. But the constant pressure took its toll. Victoria grew thinner, more anxious, the progress she had made in healing beginning to erode under the relentless assault. Daniel found himself sleeping less, worrying, more snapping at small frustrations in ways he never had before. Emma felt it too. Her teacher called to report that Emma had gotten into an argument with a classmate, something completely out of character for the usually gentle girl. When Daniel asked her about it, Emma admitted that the other kitty had said something about her family being weird about the police always coming to her house. Daniel's heart broke at the realization that Richard's campaign was reaching even into Emma's school life, poisoning the innocent world she was trying to build for herself. He sat with her that night long after her bedtime, talking about things he had never planned to discuss with an 8-year-old. He told her about bullies, about people who hurt others because they felt powerless themselves. He told her about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it seemed like the bullies were winning. He told her about her grandmother Rachel, about the promise he had made to always help people in need, about the belief that kindness was stronger than cruelty in the long run. Emma listened with the solemn attention of a child who understood on some level that she was learning something important. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said that her mom used to tell her that helping someone was like lending them your sunshine. You give them some of your light so they can see in the dark, and you never run out because sunshine keeps making more of itself. Daniel hugged her tight, hiding the tears that had sprung to his eyes. He told her that her mom was right. That was exactly how it worked. Emma pulled back and looked at him with eyes too wise for her years. She said that meant they had to keep helping Victoria even if it was hard. Because if they stopped her, sunshine might go out, and then the dark would win. Daniel promised her they would not stop. They would keep helping until Victoria was safe, until everyone was safe, until the dark had no place left to hide. The breakthrough came in late February and on a night when sleet was falling from a sky the color of bruises. Daniel was dozing in his recliner when his phone rang with Margaret Sullivan's number. Her voice was tight with controlled excitement. The FBI had moved up their timeline. New evidence had emerged, something significant enough to accelerate the entire case. Richard Blackwell was going to be arrested within the week. Daniel sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. He asked what kind of evidence. Margaret paused before answering. She explained that one of Richard's former associates had come forward, someone who had helped him cover up his activities for years. The associate was facing charges in an unrelated case and had decided to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He was providing testimony documents, everything the FBI needed to prove not just harassment and fraud, but conspiracy to commit murder. Daniel's blood ran cold. He asked what she meant by murder. Margaret's voice was grave. She said they believed Richard was responsible for at least 2 deaths. Carolyn Marsh, whose suicide now appeared to have been carefully orchestrated through systematic psychological torture. And another woman from years earlier, whose death had been ruled accidental, but whose case was now being reopened. Daniel absorbed this information, feeling the weight of it settle into his bones. He had known Richard was dangerous. He had known the man was capable of terrible things. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that they might finally be able to prove it, brought a clarity that was almost painful. He asked what would happen next. Margaret explained the timeline. The arrest would happen within days. Richard would be held without bail, given the severity of the charges and his demonstrated willingness to flee jurisdiction. The trial would take months, possibly longer, but with the evidence they had assembled, conviction was virtually certain. Daniel thanked her and ended the call. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the sleet against the windows, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The morning at Rosie's diner. The desperate woman who had walked through the door. The decision to help, despite the risks, despite the cost. It had been worth it. All of it. The sleepless nights, the legal battles, the constant fear. It had been worth it because Richard Blackwell was finally going to face justice. He thought about telling Victoria, about waking her with the news that her nightmare was almost over. But something held him back. Not doubt exactly, but a caution born of experience. He had learned not to celebrate until the victory was certain. There were still days before the arrest, days in which anything could happen. His caution proved justified in a way he could never have anticipated. 3 days later, Daniel received a call from a Detective Morrison with the Seattle Police Department. The man's voice was professionally neutral as he delivered news that shattered everything Daniel thought he knew about how this story would end. Richard Blackwell was dead. Daniel stood in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, trying to process what he was hearing. He asked how it had happened. The detective explained that it appeared to be suicide. Richard had been found in his Seattle penthouse, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had left a note, several notes actually, and Daniel's name was mentioned in one of them. Daniel felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He asked what the note said. The detective was quiet for a moment before responding. He said the note was long and rambling, a mixture of confession and accusation. Richard had acknowledged his crimes against multiple women. He had expressed what might have been remorse, though it was difficult to tell if it was genuine or merely performative. And he had named Daniel Crawford as the person who had finally brought him down. The specific passage the detective read went something like this: Crawford was the one I could never break. I could buy the lawyers. I could manipulate the system. I could make the others run or give up or destroy themselves. But he just kept standing there, just kept fighting, just kept refusing to be afraid. Meeting him made me realize I had already lost. Not because he was smarter or richer or more powerful, but because he was something I could never be. He was good, simply stubbornly, infuriatingly good. And in the end, that was what beat me. Daniel listened to these words spoken in a detective's flat recitation and felt something complex moving through him. Relief that the threat was over. Grief for the wasted potential of a life that had chosen destruction over creation. And somewhere beneath it all, a strange, uncomfortable sense of responsibility. He had not killed Richard Blackwell. He had not even wished for the man's death. But somehow, in standing firm and refusing to be intimidated, he had played a role in this ending. He had been the wall that Richard finally could not climb over or go around or tear down. The detective asked if Daniel had any questions. Daniel said he did not. He thanked the man for calling and ended the conversation. Then he sat down at his kitchen table and stared at the wall, trying to understand what he felt. Victoria found him there an hour later, still sitting, still staring. She asked what was wrong, Daniel told her. He watched her face as she absorbed the news, watched the emotions cycle through her features. Disbelief, hope, fear that it might somehow not be true, and finally, slowly, a kind of release that seemed to lighten her entire body. She asked if it was really over. Daniel nodded. Richard Blackwell was dead. The threat he had posed was gone. The federal investigation would continue to hold his estate accountable and provide justice for his victims, but the man himself would never hurt anyone again. Victoria began to cry deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere fundamental, somewhere that had been locked away for months or years. Daniel held her as she wept, offering what comfort he could, knowing that this release was necessary, that the tears were washing away something toxic that had been festering inside her. When the crying finally subsided, Victoria looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. She said she did not know how to feel. She should be relieved. She should be celebrating. But instead, she just felt empty, like she had been carrying something so heavy for so long that now that it was gone, she did not know what shape she was supposed to be. Daniel understood. He told her that was normal, that when you lived in crisis mode for long enough, peace could feel disorienting, that it would take time to learn how to exist without the constant pressure of fear. Victoria asked how he knew that. Daniel told her about Kuwait, about the months of living with death as a constant companion, about coming home and finding that safety felt stranger than danger, about the long, slow process of rebuilding a self that had learned to expect the worst. He told her that she would get through this, that it would take time and probably help from professionals who understood trauma, but that she was stronger than she knew and that she had people who would stand with her through whatever came next. Victoria nodded, accepting his words as the promise they were. Then she asked about Emma, about how they would explain this to a child. Daniel had been thinking about that. He decided they would tell her the truth in terms appropriate for her age. The bad man had done something to himself because he was very sad and very sick. He would not be bothering them anymore. They were safe now. Emma took the news better than Daniel expected. She asked a few questions, accepted the answers with the pragmatic resilience of childhood, and then asked if this meant Victoria would stay. Daniel looked at Victoria, a question in his eyes. Victoria smiled through her remaining tears. She said she would like to stay if that was okay. Not forever necessarily, but for now, until she figured out what came next. Emma declared that was perfect and asked if they could have pizza for dinner to celebrate. Daniel said they could have whatever she wanted. As he ordered the pizza and set the table and went through the ordinary motions of an ordinary evening, Daniel felt something shifting in his chest, not happiness exactly. The events were too complex, too shadowed for simple happiness, but something like peace, something like the beginning of an ending. Richard Blackwell was gone. The threat was over, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and healing. The federal investigation wound down with Richard's death, though the evidence gathered was used to compensate his victims through the liquidation of his estate. Diana Wells received enough money to rebuild her life. Patricia Kim was able to afford a lawyer who finally won back custody of her children. Carolyn Marsh's sister found some measure of closure in the official acknowledgement that her sister's death had not been a simple suicide. Victoria began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. The sessions were difficult, dredging up memories and emotions that she had buried deep, but they were also necessary. Slowly, gradually, she began to reclaim parts of herself that Richard had tried to destroy. Daniel returned to his normal routine, going to work, caring for Emma, maintaining the house that he had built with his own hands 30 years ago. But something had changed in him too. The experience had reminded him of lessons he had learned in Kuwait and then slowly forgotten. That life was precious and uncertain. That community mattered. That the small acts of kindness and courage we offer each other can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. Mrs. Henderson declared that the neighborhood could stand down from high alert. She did so with a mixture of relief and what might have been disappointment. Organizing the watch had given her a sense of purpose that her retirement had been lacking. Daniel suggested that she might enjoy volunteering with a local organization that helped domestic violence survivors. She said she would think about it, and 3 weeks later, she was leading a fundraising committee. Spring came to Portland with its usual mixture of rain and tentative sunshine. The cherry trees along Maple Street burst into bloom, painting the neighborhood in shades of pink and white. Emma started swimming lessons at the YMCA, something she had been asking about for months. Victoria began taking photographs again, rebuilding her artistic practice one image at a time. On a warm Saturday morning in April, Daniel sat in his usual booth at Rosie's Diner, drinking coffee and watching the sunlight stream through the windows. It had been exactly 6 months since the morning Victoria had walked through that door soaked and desperate and ready to give up. So much had changed since then. So much had been lost and found and transformed. He had come to this booth as a tired old man trying to keep a promise to his dead wife. He was leaving it as something else, something more. Someone who had discovered that even at 58, even after everything, there was still capacity for growth and change and love. Betty appeared at his elbow, coffee pot in hand. She observed that he looked different today, lighter, like someone had lifted something heavy off his shoulders. Daniel admitted that something like that had happened. He told her that the situation with the woman with Victoria had finally resolved. The man who had been threatening her was gone. She was safe. They were all safe. Betty nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had watched the story unfold from the beginning. She said she was glad. She added that Daniel was a good man for helping her. Not everyone would have gotten involved. Daniel thought about that. He said he was not sure he'd had a choice. When you see someone who needs help, really see them, how can you walk away? Betty smiled and refilled his coffee. She said that was exactly what made him a good man. Plenty of people could walk away. The ones who could not were the ones who made the world worth living in. She moved on to help another customer, and Daniel sat with his coffee, watching the morning unfold through the rain-streaked windows. In a few hours, Victoria and Emma would be expecting him home. They had plans to visit the farmer's market, the same one where they had gathered evidence against Richard all those months ago. Now it was just a farmer's market again, just a place to buy fresh vegetables and enjoy a spring morning. Life continued. That was the remarkable thing. No matter what happened, no matter how dark things got, life continued. And if you were lucky, if you were brave, if you refused to give up, you got to see the sunrise on the other side of the darkness. Daniel finished his coffee, left his usual tip, and walked out into the spring sunshine. His truck was parked in its usual spot. His neighborhood waited at the end of a familiar drive. His family, strange and beautiful and forged in crisis, was waiting for him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt like something to look forward to rather than something to survive. The peace that followed Richard Blackwell's death was not the simple relief Daniel had expected. It came in waves, sometimes washing over him with a gentle calm, other times receding to reveal jagged rocks of emotion he had not known were there. He found himself waking at odd hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the past months, with a clarity that felt almost hallucinogenic. The nightmares returned, not about Richard, but about Kuwait, dreams of sand and smoke, and the particular copper smell of blood in desert heat. He had not dreamed about the war in years, had thought that chapter of his life finally closed. But the stress of the past months had pried it open again. He would wake gasping, heart pounding, the sheets soaked with sweat, and it would take long minutes to convince himself that he was in Portland, in his house safe. Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed. She was attuned to signs of trauma in a way that only someone who had lived through their own could be. One morning after a particularly bad night, she found him sitting on the back porch at dawn, coffee growing cold and his hands and eyes fixed on nothing. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence a quiet anchor. After a long silence, she asked if he wanted to talk about it. Daniel considered the question. He had spent 30 years not talking about Kuwait, burying those memories under layers of work and family in the simple business of getting through each day. But something had shifted. The walls he had built felt less like protection now and more like prison. He told her about the convoy, about the explosion that had killed 3 of his friends and left him with a limp he still carried, about the months of recovery, physical and mental, that had nearly broken him, about Rachel who had held him together when he could not hold himself. Victoria listened without interruption, her hand finding his somewhere in the middle of the story. When he finished, she did not offer platitudes or try to fix what could not be fixed. She simply said that she understood, that carrying something like that changed a person in ways others could not see, that she was grateful he had trusted her enough to share it. Daniel felt something release in his chest, a knot he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. He said he had never told anyone the full story before, not even his son. He had always thought that keeping it buried was the same as being strong. Victoria's response cut through decades of masculine stoicism with surgical precision. She said that burying pain did not make it go away. It just meant you carried it alone. And carrying things alone was not strength. It was just loneliness wearing a different mask. The words hit Daniel with the force of revelation. He sat with them for a long time, turning them over in his mind, feeling the truth of them settle into his bones. Mrs. Henderson, in her characteristically direct way, provided the next push. She appeared at his door one afternoon with a flyer for a veterans support group that met at the VA hospital every Tuesday evening. She did not ask if he was interested. She simply handed him the flyer and said she expected to hear that he had attended at least one meeting. Daniel protested that he was fine, that he did not need to sit in a circle and share his feelings with strangers. Mrs. Henderson fixed him with a look that had probably terrified young soldiers in Vietnam. She said that was exactly what someone who needed help would say. She added that she had seen enough men destroy themselves with that kind of pride. She was not going to watch it happen to him. He went to the meeting. The first one was awkward, uncomfortable, everything he had expected it to be. A circle of folding chairs in a fluorescent lit room, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous war, men of various ages sharing stories that ranged from mundane to harrowing. Daniel sat in the back and said nothing, feeling like an imposter despite the memories that still woke him at night. But something made him go back. And the second meeting was slightly less awkward. And the third, and gradually over weeks and months, he began to understand what Mrs. Henderson had known all along, that there was healing in shared experience, that saying the words out loud robbed them of some of their power, that he was not alone in carrying these invisible wounds, and that carrying them together made them lighter. He started talking in the meetings, small things at first, then larger ones. The convoy, the explosion, the guilt of surviving when others had not, the fear that he had passed something broken down to his son who had died too young and might be passing it to his granddaughter. The men in the circle listened without judgment, offering nods of recognition, occasional words of their own experience. Not advice, just acknowledgement, just witness. Daniel began to sleep better. The nightmares did not disappear entirely, but they became less frequent, less vivid, less capable of destroying an entire day with their aftermath. He started to feel like himself again, or perhaps like a new version of himself, one that had finally integrated the broken pieces instead of just hiding them. Victoria, meanwhile, was fighting her own battles with recovery. The therapist she had been seeing helped, but there were limits to what could be accomplished while living in the house where so much of the crisis had unfolded. The memories were everywhere, woven into the walls and furniture and the very air she breathed. In early May, she told Daniel that her therapist had recommended a residential treatment program. 6 months of intensive work at a facility in California that specialized in trauma recovery. It would mean leaving Portland, leaving him and Emma and the life they had begun to build together. Daniel felt his heart constrict at the news, but he kept his voice steady. He asked if she thought it would help. Victoria said she did not know, but she knew that she was not healing as fast as she wanted to, that there were depths of damage she had not yet touched, parts of herself that Richard had broken, that she had not yet found the courage to examine. The program offered a chance to do that work in a supported environment with professionals who understood what she had been through. Daniel took her hands in his, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that still appeared when she was emotional. He told her that she should go, that her healing was the most important thing, that he and Emma would be here when she got back. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She said she was afraid, afraid of the work she would have to do, afraid of what she might find when she dug into the deepest wounds, and afraid that when she came back, if she came back, things would be different, that he would have moved on, that the connection they had built would have faded. Daniel pulled her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest. He made her a promise that he would be here, that he would wait, that 6 months was nothing compared to what they had already survived together, and that if she needed more time, he would wait for that too, because some things were worth waiting for. They had 2 weeks before she left, 2 weeks of ordinary moments that felt precious in their impermanence. Dinners together, walks in the neighborhood, evenings on the porch watching the sunset. Emma, who had been told that Victoria needed to go away for a while to get better, responded with the resilient acceptance of childhood, asking only that Victoria promise to come back. Victoria made the promise. She knelt down to Emma's level and looked her in the eyes and swore that she would return, that nothing in the world could keep her away, that Emma had become part of her heart and you could not stay away from your own heart for long. The morning of Victoria's departure was gray and drizzling, classic Portland weather that seemed to match the mood. Daniel drove her to the airport, Emma insisting on coming, despite the early hour. They stood together at the security checkpoint, the point beyond which Daniel and Emma could not follow. Victoria hugged Emma first, a long embrace that left both of them teary-eyed. She whispered something in the girl's ear that made Emma nod solemnly. Then she turned to Daniel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what passed between them, the gratitude and affection, and something deeper that had not yet been named. Daniel said he would miss her, that the house would feel empty without her, that he was proud of her for having the courage to do this work. Victoria touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of sun and worry had carved into his skin. She said she would miss him too, more than she could express. But she needed to do this. She needed to find out who she was without the fear, without the trauma, without the shadow of Richard Blackwell darkening every corner of her mind. Daniel nodded. He understood. He told her to take all the time she needed, to do the work, to come back whole. Victoria kissed him, then a soft press of lips that held promise and farewell in equal measure. Then she picked up her bag, showed her boarding pass to the agent, and walked through the security checkpoint without looking back. Daniel stood watching until she disappeared into the crowd of travelers. Emma's hand found his small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Emma said she hoped Victoria would be okay. Daniel squeezed her hand. He said Victoria was one of the strongest people he had ever met. She would be more than okay. She would come back better than ever. They walked back to the truck together, and Daniel tried not to think about how long 6 months could feel when you were waiting for someone you loved. The months passed with the particular slowness of time spent waiting. Daniel threw himself into work, into caring for Emma, into the veterans group that had become an unexpected anchor in his life. He fixed the loose shutter that had been bothering him for months. He painted the porch. He started teaching Emma how to use basic tools, watching her small hands learn to grip a hammer, feeling the continuity of skills passed down through generations. Victoria sent letters, real letters handwritten on paper because the treatment program limited electronic communication. Daniel saved everyone reading them multiple times before adding them to a growing stack in his bedside drawer. The letters charted her progress through the program. The initial resistance, the breakthrough moments, the setbacks and recoveries that marked any genuine healing process. She wrote about memories she had uncovered, fears she had confronted, parts of herself she was slowly reclaiming from the wreckage Richard had left behind. She also wrote about missing him, missing Emma, missing the house on Maple Street and the booth at Rosie's Diner, and the particular way Portland light filtered through clouds. She wrote that she was counting in the days until she could return. Daniel wrote back, though his letters were shorter, less eloquent. He told her about Emma's progress in school, about Mrs. Henderson's new volunteer work, about the neighborhood gossip that she had become surprisingly invested in during her time with them. He told her that the house felt too quiet without her, that he was counting the days too. The 6 months stretched into 7 when Victoria's therapist recommended an extended stay to complete a particularly important phase of treatment. Daniel told her to take all the time she needed. He meant it even as the waiting grew harder. Spring arrived again, marking almost a full year since the morning Victoria had walked into Rosie's diner. Daniel sat in his usual booth on the anniversary drinking coffee and remembering. So much had changed. So much had been lost and found. He was not the same man who had pushed a plate of eggs across a table to a desperate stranger. He was someone new, someone shaped by the experiences of the past year, someone who had discovered reserves of strength and compassion he had not known he possessed. Betty appeared with her coffee pot, a knowing look in her eyes. She observed that he was being contemplative again. She asked if the lady was coming back soon. Daniel said he hoped so, any day now. The program was complete. She was making arrangements. Betty nodded with satisfaction. She said that was good. She added that she had never seen him light up the way he did when that woman was around. It suited him. Daniel felt heat rise to his cheeks, a reaction he would have thought himself too old for. He said Betty should mind her own business. Betty laughed and refilled his coffee. She said minding her own business had never been her strong suit, and she was too old to start now. The call came 3 days later. Victoria's voice on the phone, strong and clear and alive with an energy he had not heard in months. She was ready. She was coming home. Her flight would arrive on Saturday. Daniel felt his heart lift in a way that made him feel like a teenager. He said he would be there. They would both be there. They could not wait to see her. Victoria laughed, a sound like music. She said she could not wait either. That she had dreamed about this moment for months. That she had so much to tell him, so much to share, so much she had learned about herself and what she wanted from the life that lay ahead. Saturday arrived with sunshine, the first truly warm day of spring. Daniel and Emma drove to the airport together, Emma bouncing in her seat with anticipation. They waited at the arrivals gate, watching the stream of travelers emerge from the secure area, scanning every face for the one they were looking for. And then she was there. Victoria walked through the gate looking transformed. Not physically, though she had gained some weight and her color was better than Daniel had ever seen it. The change was something deeper. Something in the way she carried herself, the set of her shoulders, the light in her eyes. She moved like someone who had put down a heavy burden and learned to walk without it. Emma broke away from Daniel and ran toward her, throwing herself into Victoria's arms with the abandon of a child reunited with someone she loved. Victoria caught her, lifted her, spun her around while both of them laughed. Daniel walked toward them more slowly, savoring the moment, watching the two people he loved most in the world embrace. When he reached them, Victoria set Emma down and turned to face him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, taking in the changes, the growth, the evidence of time passed and work done. Daniel saw the woman Victoria had become whole and healed and ready for whatever came next. And in her eyes, he saw her, seeing him, seeing the man he had grown into during her absence. Victoria spoke first. She said she was home. Daniel reached out and took her hand. He said yes, she was home. They walked out of the airport together, Emma chattering about everything that had happened while Victoria was away. Victoria listening with the patient attention that Daniel had always loved about her. He drove them home through streets that were familiar and yet somehow new, transformed by the presence of this woman who had become so essential to his life. The months that followed were a period of careful, deliberate rebuilding. Victoria found an apartment in the neighborhood close enough to visit easily, but separate enough to maintain the independence she needed. She began rebuilding her photography career, starting with small projects, local events, the kind of work that let her ease back into her craft without overwhelming pressure. Daniel and Victoria's relationship evolved slowly, organically, like a plant reaching toward light. They went on dates, actual dates, something neither of them had done in years. Dinners at quiet restaurants, walks along the waterfront, afternoons at museums and galleries, Victoria teaching Daniel to see art in ways he never had before. They talked for hours, sharing the details of their lives that had accumulated during the separation, filling in the gaps, building the foundation of understanding that any real partnership required. Daniel told her about the veterans group, about the memories he had finally learned to speak aloud, about the healing he had found in community. Victoria told him about the program, about the dark places she had explored, and the light she had found on the other side. Emma remained the joyful center of both their lives, the common ground that had first brought them together and continued to bind them. She spent weekends with Victoria learning about photography and art. She spent weekdays with Daniel learning about construction and tools and the satisfaction of building things with your hands. Mrs. Henderson watched the developing relationship with the satisfied air of someone who had seen the ending coming all along. She made comments about wedding bells and grandbabies, comments that Daniel deflected with practiced embarrassment but secretly treasured. 2 years passed. 2 years of ordinary days and small joys. 2 years of healing and growth. 2 years of learning to be together, to trust, to build something lasting from the ashes of what had been destroyed. On a clear evening in autumn, Daniel drove Victoria to the backyard of the house on Maple Street. The workshop stood there, rebuilt by the community after Richard had burned the original, a testament to the power of neighbors who cared for each other. He led her inside where he had spent weeks preparing. The space was clean and warm, filled with the smell of sawdust and fresh wood. A small table held a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Candles provided soft light, and in the center of the room, on a workbench he had built with his own hands, sat a small wooden box. Victoria looked around, taking in the scene, understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. She asked what this was. Daniel picked up the box and opened it, revealing a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the candlelight. His voice was steady as he spoke. He told her that he was not good at speeches, that he had never been good with words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. But some things needed to be said out loud, and this was one of them. He said that 2 years ago she had walked into his life desperate and broken and ready to give up. He had offered her a plate of eggs and a promise that she was not alone. He had not known then what that promise would cost or where it would lead. He had only known that helping her was the right thing to do. He said that somewhere along the way, helping her had become something more. Caring about her had become loving her, and loving her had become as natural and necessary as breathing. He said he was 58 years old. He had lived through war and loss and grief. He had buried a wife and a son. He had raised a granddaughter through circumstances no one should have to face. He knew that life was uncertain, that tomorrow was never guaranteed, that the future was a mystery that could not be solved. But he also knew that he wanted to spend whatever time he had left with her, that he wanted to wake up beside her and fall asleep beside her and share all the ordinary moments in between, that he wanted to be her partner, her companion, her family. He held out the ring. He asked if she would marry him. Victoria was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was also smiling, a radiant expression that lit up the dim workshop like sunrise. She said yes, 1,000 times yes, that she had been waiting for this question without knowing she was waiting, that he was the best man she had ever known, that she could not imagine spending her life with anyone else. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the rightness of the moment settle over him like a blessing. He pulled her close and kissed her, tasting salt tears and joy, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to hope for. They stood together in the workshop, holding each other as the candles flickered and the autumn wind whispered outside. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other. Two survivors who had become partners. Two hearts that had learned to beat together. The wedding was small and simple, held in the backyard of the house on Maple Street on a spring day, exactly 1 year after the proposal. 30 people gathered among the flower beds that Rachel had planted, and Daniel had maintained family and friends who had witnessed the journey that had led to this moment. Emma served as flower girl, scattering petals with serious concentration. Mrs. Henderson officiated, having obtained the necessary certifications specifically for this purpose. George Palmer stood as Daniel's witness. Diana Wells, who had traveled from Montana for the occasion, stood as Victoria's. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt. Daniel and Victoria wrote their own vows, speaking words that came from the deepest places in their hearts. Daniel spoke of second chances, of the miracle of finding love twice in one lifetime, of the gratitude he felt for every moment they had shared and every moment yet to come. Victoria spoke of rescue and redemption, of a man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, of a home she had found when she thought she would never have one again. When they exchanged rings, when they spoke the words that made them husband and wife, Daniel felt something complete itself inside him, a circle closing, a journey reaching its destination. He had kept his promise to Rachel. He had helped someone who needed it, and in doing so he had found something he had never expected to find again. The reception was joyous and uncomplicated. Betty catered the food from Rosie's diner. Neighbors brought dishes to share. Someone set up a speaker playing music from the decades when Daniel and Victoria had grown up, and people danced on the grass as the afternoon faded into evening. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Daniel stood with his arm around his wife, watching their guests enjoy themselves. Emma danced with George Palmer, both of them laughing at their own clumsiness. Mrs. Henderson held court in a corner, telling stories that had the listeners alternately shocked and amused. Victoria's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the easy intimacy of people who belong together. Victoria said she never thought she would have this, a wedding, a family, a place to belong. Daniel said he never thought he would have it again. He had been ready to spend the rest of his life alone, content maybe, peaceful even, but alone. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. She said they had both been wrong. They had both been given a gift they had not expected, and the only appropriate response to such a gift was gratitude. Daniel kissed the top of her head. He said he was grateful, every day. For her, for Emma, for this life they had built together, for the morning at Rosie's diner when he had decided to give his breakfast to a stranger, for every choice and chance that had led them here. Victoria smiled up at him. She said that was her favorite story, the one about the eggs. She was going to tell it at parties for the rest of their lives. Daniel laughed a sound of pure happiness. He said he could live with that. 5 years passed, 5 years of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. 5 years of building a life together, of watching Emma grow, of becoming more deeply themselves and more deeply connected. Daniel retired from construction at 63, his body finally demanding rest after decades of physical labor. He spent his days in the workshop teaching neighborhood children the skills he had spent his life acquiring, passing on the knowledge before it was lost. Victoria's photography career flourished, her work appearing in galleries across the Pacific Northwest, her images telling stories of resilience and hope. Emma grew into a teenager, then a young woman, with all the complications and joys that entailed. She inherited her grandmother's artistic eye and her grandfather's stubborn integrity, a combination that made her formidable in ways that sometimes terrified Daniel. She decided she wanted to be a photojournalist to travel the world telling stories that mattered, and neither Daniel nor Victoria was surprised. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep at 83, leaving behind a legacy of service in a neighborhood that had been transformed by her presence. Her house went to Daniel in her will, along with a note that said she trusted him to use it well. He converted it into a community center, a place where neighbors could gather, where support groups could meet, where the kind of connections that had saved his life could be forged for others. On a clear October morning, exactly 10 years after Victoria had walked into Rosie's diner, Daniel sat in his usual booth with his wife and his granddaughter. Emma was 18 now, about to leave for college on the East Coast, and this breakfast was both celebration and farewell. Betty had retired 3 years earlier, but she came in that morning just to serve them. The Crawford special, she announced, placing plates in front of each of them. For the whole family. Emma rolled her eyes with the affectionate exasperation of a teenager. She pointed out that Grandpa had told this story about 1,000,000 times. Daniel smiled. He said he would tell it 1,000,000 more. Some stories were worth repeating. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. She said the story had everything: romance, danger, a heroic sacrifice. Daniel shook his head. He insisted it was not heroic. He had just given her a plate of eggs. Victoria's eyes met his, full of love and memory. She said he had given her hope, and that was worth more than he would ever know. Emma looked between them, her expression softening, despite her teenage instinct to appear unimpressed. She said she was going to miss this. The stories, the diner, the family they had become. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He told her that she could come home any time, that home would always be here, that family was not about geography but about love. Emma nodded, blinking back tears she would never admit to. She said she knew she had learned that lesson watching him, watching both of them, watching what they had built from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. They ate breakfast together, talking about Emma's plans, about Victoria's upcoming exhibition, about the community center, and the lives it was changing. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, the same light that had illuminated that first morning 10 years ago, the same light that would continue to shine long after they were gone. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at the door, looking back at the booth where so much had happened. He thought about Rachel, who had first brought him here, about the promise he had made to always help those in need, about the stranger who had become his wife, the crisis that had become his purpose, the life that had grown from a single act of kindness. He thought about what he would tell someone who asked what it all meant, what lesson could be drawn from the journey of the past decade. And he knew exactly what he would say. He would say that life breaks everyone, that loss and grief and fear are inevitable, that the darkness comes for all of us sooner or later. But he would also say that the darkness is not the end, that there is always light somewhere if you are willing to look for it, that the light we share with each other, the kindness we offer to strangers, the love we build with those who become family, that light is stronger than any darkness. He would say that helping someone is like lending them your sunshine. You give them some of your light so they can see in the dark. And you never run out because sunshine keeps making more of itself. He would say that Daniel Crawford was not a hero. He was just an old man who had learned over many years and much pain that the only thing worth doing with a life was using it to help others, that the only thing worth building was connection, that the only thing worth leaving behind was love. Victoria appeared at his elbow, slipping her hand into his. She asked if he was ready to go. Daniel took one last look at the booth, at the diner, at the place where everything had begun. Then he turned to his wife and smiled. He said yes, he was ready. They walked out into the October sunshine together, Emma bounding ahead toward the car, the future stretching before them like an open road. Behind them, the door of Rosie's diner swung closed with a soft chime, and the story continued.